Imagine a city that stood for 11 centuries without ever being taken by force. Not a century, not 2 or 3, 11. While empires rose and collapsed around it, while plague swept through its streets and earthquakes cracked its foundations, and armies gathered at its gates again and again and again, the city endured. Conquerors came, they looked at the walls, they calculated the odds, and one by one they turned around and went home. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople was simply that kind of place, the kind of place that made the impossible seem routine. And then, in the spring of 1453, it fell in 53 days. That contrast is almost too sharp to absorb. 1,100 years of survival against one of the most determined military campaigns the medieval world had ever seen, and it was over in less than 2 months. The city that had outlasted everything, that had watched the Western Roman Empire crumble into memory, that had bent but never broken through siege after siege after siege, was taken by a 21-year-old sultan with a weapon so new the world barely had a name for it yet. How does that happen? How does something that seemed structurally impossible to destroy suddenly stop being impossible? That's the question at the centre of all of this, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer isn't simple. It isn't just about cannons or courage or the particular genius of one commander. It's about the slow accumulation of centuries, about an empire quietly hollowing out from within while projecting the appearance of permanence, about a city positioned at the exact crossroads where East met West, where Christian Europe faced the expanding Ottoman world, where trade routes and faiths and ambitions all converged on a single strip of land between 2 seas. Constantinople wasn't just a city, it was an idea, a symbol, the inheritor of Rome, the guardian of Orthodox Christianity, the commercial hub connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea to the Silk Road beyond. To hold it was to hold something that felt almost metaphysical, like owning the centre of the world. And that meant every power with large enough ambitions eventually pointed itself at those famous walls and asked the same question. Can we be the ones who finally break it? For 1,000 years the answer came back the same. No, you cannot. Until the answer changed. Over the next little while, we're going to move through that story slowly. We'll look at the walls themselves, at the long history of failed attempts, at the gradual decline of an empire that once stretched across 3 continents, at the young man who decided he would not accept the same answer everyone before him had received, and at the 53 days that rewrote the map of the world. We'll try to understand not just what happened, but why it happened when it did, and what it meant for the centuries that followed. This is the kind of history that deserves to be absorbed gradually, in the quiet, in the dark, when the mind is soft and receptive and time feels a little less urgent. So if you're listening late at night with the lights already off, or drifting somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, you're exactly where this story wants you to be. Before we go any further, I'd love to know where you are right now and what time it is wherever you're listening from. Drop it in the comments. Someone in Istanbul, perhaps, not far from where all of this happened. Someone in a completely different corner of the world entirely. I always read them, and there's something quietly wonderful about knowing how far these stories travel, now. Let's talk about a city that seemed impossible to break. To understand why so many empires pointed themselves at Constantinople, you have to look at a map. The city sits at a narrow strait called the Bosporus, a channel of water barely half a mile wide at its tightest point, connecting the Black Sea to the north with the Sea of Marmara to the south, and through that to the Mediterranean beyond. Europe is on one side, Asia is on the other, and Constantinople sits directly in the middle, controlling the passage between them. That position isn't just strategically convenient, it's almost absurdly powerful. Any ship moving goods from the grain-rich ports of the Black Sea southward toward the markets of the Mediterranean had to pass through Constantinople's waters. Any army hoping to move between the European and Asian halves of a continent had to either cross near Constantinople or travel enormous distances around it. For centuries, this made the city not just a political capital, but a kind of toll booth at the centre of the known world. Wealth flowed through it the way water flows through a narrow canyon, concentrating building pressure, generating enormous energy. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that made Constantinople its heart, understood this perfectly. The city was their capital in the administrative sense, yes, but it was also something harder to define. It was the place where Roman law and Greek philosophy and Christian theology had been folded together into a single civilization. The emperor ruled from here. The patriarch of the Orthodox Church presided here. The great markets and the famous Hagia Sophia and the accumulated treasures of 1,000 years of empire all concentrated in this one city, on its triangular peninsula between the Bosporus and the Golden Horn. For rivals, this was maddening in the most irresistible way. Constantinople represented everything they wanted: wealth, prestige, legitimacy, control over the passage between continents. To take it would not simply mean capturing a city. It would mean inheriting a claim to something enormous, the idea of Rome itself, the mantle of civilization, the commanding height from which you could project power in every direction at once. So they kept coming. Persian armies, Arab fleets, Viking raiders from the north who called the city Miklagard, the great city, as if no other name was necessary, Bulgarian Khans, Crusader knights who arrived nominally as allies and stayed to wonder whether they might take the prize themselves. The city drew ambition the way candlelight draws moths, and for most of those 1,000 years it burned them just the same. Part of what made Constantinople so devastating to attack was not just where it sat, it was what surrounded it. The city occupied a roughly triangular peninsula. To the south, the Sea of Marmara. To the northeast, a narrow inlet called the Golden Horn. To the west, the only approach by land, a stretch of open ground where any army hoping to take the city would have to make its case. And it was here, along that western, landward approach, that the Byzantines had built something that military engineers still study with a kind of quiet awe: the Theodosian walls. Constructed in the early 5th century under the Emperor Theodosius II, completed around 413 AD, and then expanded and reinforced over the centuries that followed. Not a wall exactly, a system, a layered argument in stone and earth that said, in the plainest possible terms, that no army was getting through. Here is how it worked. An attacker approaching from the west would first encounter a moat. Not a shallow decorative ditch, but a genuine obstacle, roughly 60 feet wide and anywhere from 15 to 30 feet deep depending on the section, lined in some places with a low protective wall of its own. Cross the moat somehow, under fire, with your men soaked and your ladders slipping, and you would arrive at the outer wall. This was not a minor structure. It stood roughly 27 feet high, solid enough to stop almost any assault, studded with towers that jutted forward at intervals so that defenders could shoot along the face of the wall rather than simply down from it, catching attackers in a crossfire from multiple angles simultaneously. But survive the outer wall, and you were still not inside the city. Behind it rose the inner wall, the Theodosian wall proper, taller and thicker than anything you had just crossed, nearly 40 feet high in places, towers rising even higher, some to 60 feet, placed at regular intervals and designed so that each one could cover the approaches of the ones beside it. The wall itself was thick enough that defenders could move along its top with room to spare, repositioning, bringing materials, organizing the response to wherever the attack was heaviest. The total depth of this system from the outer edge of the moat to the inner face of the Great Wall measured something close to 200 feet. An army didn't breach it so much as have to fight its way through layers of punishment, each one more severe than the last. The materials were Roman in the most literal sense. Alternating bands of stone and brick laid in a pattern that distributed stress, absorbed the shock of battering rams and debris in ways that pure stone sometimes could not. Engineers today recognize it as surprisingly sophisticated. The walls weren't just thick. They were built to flex slightly, to absorb, to endure. And then there were the sea walls. The Theodosian system gets most of the attention, but the city's waterfront was defended as well, walls running along the Sea of Marmara to the south and along the Golden Horn to the northeast. The Marmara walls were substantial structures in their own right, though the currents there were treacherous enough that a naval assault from that direction was difficult to sustain. The Golden Horn offered calmer water, but the Byzantines had a solution for that: a massive iron chain, anchored at either end of the inlet's mouth, that could be raised to block any hostile fleet from entering. The chain sat heavy in the water when lowered, and when raised it closed the horn like a door, protecting the harbour inside and denying any enemy fleet the ability to attack the sea walls from that direction or land troops along the northern shore. It was a simple idea executed at enormous scale, and it worked. What you get, when you step back and look at all of this together, is a city that was essentially defended on 3 sides by water it partially controlled, and on the 4th side by the most sophisticated land fortification the medieval world would know. There are scholars who argue, reasonably, that the Theodosian walls represented the single greatest defensive achievement of their age. Not because they were the tallest or the longest or built from any magical material, but because of the thinking behind them. The layering, the redundancy, the way each element covered the weaknesses of the one before it, and the record supports the reputation. Arab armies besieged Constantinople twice, in the 7th and 8th centuries, in sieges that lasted years. They did not get through. A Bulgarian force encamped outside the walls in the 9th century and eventually went home. Viking fleets that had terrorized the coasts of half of Europe arrived here and found that reputation was one thing and stone was another. The city watched generations of enemies arrive, encamp, suffer and withdraw. It outlasted their supplies. It outlasted their patience. In some cases it outlasted the civilizations that had sent them. There is something almost disorienting about this record when you sit with it. The walls were not unmanned or maintained by some supernatural force. They required soldiers, engineers, money, leadership, grain, water, all the ordinary necessities that any defense depends on. When those things were present, the walls performed. When they weren't, the city struggled. But for most of those 11 centuries, the system held, and holding became its own kind of legend. Enemies who studied Constantinople's history before attacking it would have read the same record and come to the same conclusion. This was the city that did not fall. That had not fallen. That, in some deep sense, was defined by its refusal to fall. It was a reputation that had been 1,000 years in the making, and it would take something genuinely new to break it. If you stand on those walls in your mind for a moment, looking out over that flat expanse of ground to the west, you can almost see the ghosts of the armies that tried. They begin early. Before the Theodosian system is even complete, the idea of this place as a prize is already taking shape. In the 6th century, Persian kings look across at the Roman Empire, now ruled from this city rather than Rome itself, and understand very clearly that if you can take Constantinople, you don't just win a battle, you decapitate a civilization. The Sassanid Persians never quite get there in full force. They fight bitter wars with the Eastern Roman Empire, they capture great cities in Syria and Egypt, they even push to the Bosporus and threaten the suburbs. In the 620s, while the Emperor Heraclius is off on a desperate counteroffensive in their homeland, Persian forces camp on the Asian shore opposite Constantinople, allied with a powerful nomadic group called the Avars on the European side. In 626, the Avars bring siege towers and rams up to the land walls. The Persians bombard from across the water. It's a kind of pincer movement across continents, coordinated by signal fires and messengers, a rare moment when multiple enemies of Byzantium are actually working together. For a few tense days, it looks like the city might be facing something truly existential. And then the weaknesses of the coalition begin to show. The Avars are formidable horsemen, deadly in the open, less comfortable staring up at 40 feet of stone while being pelted with arrows and stones and Greek insults. The Persians, stuck on the far bank, can't bring enough boats to force a crossing under fire. Byzantine ships dart along the Bosporus, ramming, boarding, burning transports before they can unload. The defenders patch cracks in the walls, rush reinforcements to weak points, improvise where plans fail. Disease begins to flicker through the siege camps. Camp latrines are too close to water sources. Food has to be hauled long distances over muddy tracks. Grain spoils in damp weather, horses die, morale wavers. After a few weeks of intense effort, the alliance frays, the Avars pull back. The Persians can do little but watch from their bank of the strait. The siege ends not in a dramatic final assault, but in a gradual slackening, like a fist unclenching. People inside the city remember this. In later generations, preachers will retell the story as a miracle. The Virgin Mary, they say, intervened. Hymns are composed. Processions celebrate not just the survival, but the manner of it. Against odds, against multiple enemies, against a storm that somehow passed around them, this will become a pattern. The material reality on the ground, logistics, terrain, tactics, will do most of the work. The meaning people attach to it will do the rest. A few decades later, the next great challenge arrives from the south and east. The Arab conquests explode out of Arabia with a speed that stuns the Mediterranean world. Within a generation, the new caliphate has swallowed Syria, Egypt, North Africa. Old Roman provinces vanish into a new religious and political order. The question becomes unavoidable. Will Constantinople be next? In 674, Arab fleets and armies begin what later historians call the First Arab Siege of Constantinople. It is not a single continuous encirclement, so much as a series of campaigns focused on the city, stretching over several years. Raiding forces establish bases along the coasts of Asia Minor, probing the sea walls, testing defences. Logistically, this is an enormous undertaking. The caliphate's heartlands are far away. Every soldier outside the walls must be fed from supply lines that reach back across newly conquered territories, still not fully integrated or pacified. Silos have to be filled. Grain has to be shipped. Animals have to be driven. Fleets have to be maintained through winter storms on unfamiliar seas. Inside the city, the defenders are on edge but not paralyzed. The Byzantines still have something their enemies do not: an experienced navy, built over centuries of operating in exactly these waters, and they have something else, a closely guarded weapon that Arab sources will later describe with a mixture of fear and fascination: Greek fire. We don't know exactly how it was made. Modern chemists and historians have theories. A petroleum-based mixture, perhaps, thickened with resins, projected through bronze tubes on the decks of ships and ignited as it left the nozzle. Whatever it was, it burned on water. It clung to wood and flesh. It turned naval engagements into scenes of chaos and horror. When Arab fleets push toward the city, they encounter this new reality. Byzantine dromons, warships built for speed and maneuverability, close in, unleash jets of flame, and withdraw before they can be boarded. Some enemy ships panic and collide. Others try to flee, only to be caught later in narrow straits where the defenders know every current and hidden shoal. The siege drags on, season after season. Winters in Thrace are not kind to men in exposed camps. Wet canvas, cold wind from the north, snow that melts into mud. Sickness spreads. Horses lose condition. Supply ships wreck in storms. Eventually, Arab commanders calculate the balance and decide the cost is too high. The pressure lifts. The city again has not fallen. Roughly 50 years later, in 717 to 718, the Caliphate tries again with more deliberation. This time, an enormous land army under Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik crosses into Thrace, while a large fleet sails up from the Aegean and into the Sea of Marmara. Chroniclers speak of hundreds, even thousands of ships. The numbers are probably exaggerated, but the intent is clear: a full encirclement, land and sea, designed to starve the city into submission. For months, the noose tightens. Farms outside the walls burn, villages empty. Refugees crowd inside the city gates. Bread is rationed. People watch the horizon for sails that are not theirs. Then the weather chooses sides. The winter of 717 to 718 is one of the harshest in memory. Snow lies deep in the Thracian countryside for months. Arab horses die in droves. Soldiers far from home, undersupplied and undersheltered, succumb to frostbite, disease, hunger. Forage runs out. Carts that were supposed to bring food cannot move. Meanwhile, Byzantine ships use Greek fire to harass the blockading fleet, burning some, capturing others, cutting supply lines without having to face the full weight of the Arab navy at once. By spring, the besieging army is a shadow of what it was, reinforcements coming by sea mutiny or defect. The new caliph, far away, has his own political problems. Orders go out, withdraw. Those who survive the retreat carry with them both the memory of hardship and a new piece of information. This city is not only strongly walled, it is somehow unlucky for its attackers. A legend is building, layer by layer. It's not just the great caliphates and empires that test Constantinople. To the north, across the Black Sea, and down the rivers of what is now Ukraine and Russia, another people learn the city's name, the Rus. They are traders and raiders of Scandinavian origin at first, moving along the great river systems with shallow draft boats, carrying furs, slaves, wax and weapons. The Byzantines know them as Varangians. Sometimes they hire them as mercenaries, sometimes they fight them. In 860, a Rus fleet appears suddenly on the Bosporus while the emperor is away campaigning. They ravage the suburbs, plunder churches outside the walls. There is real panic. But when they row up to the sea walls themselves, they face the same cold calculation every attacker must make. High stone, artillery, boiling liquids, missiles raining down from above. No easy way up, no easy way around. Their ships are not equipped for a protracted blockade. They lack the numbers to invest the landward side. After a short, violent raid, they leave with what they can carry and the city stands. Later Rus attacks, in 907 and 941, follow similar patterns. Fleets descend, test the defences, sometimes burn villages or coastal outposts. But when they try to force the narrow passages near the city itself, they run into chains, boom defences and once again Greek fire. One account describes Rus boats and men burning in the water, the survivors trying desperately to dive under the flames. The lesson is unpleasant but clear. This harbour is not a place for amateurs. More than once the Rus return not as besiegers, but as bodyguards. The emperors recruit them into an elite unit, the Varangian Guard, stationed inside the palace complex. The message is subtle but powerful. Those who can't take the city from the outside might, in time, find a place within its system, protecting the very walls they once dreamed of breaching. All of this repetition has effects on both sides of the stone. For enemies, Constantinople becomes a kind of cautionary tale. Generals and rulers consult advisors, study chronicles, listen to veterans. They hear the same themes over and over: long supply lines, harsh winters, sickness in the siege camps, fires in the fleet. The problem of trying to blockade a city that can be resupplied by sea as long as it controls the straits. The difficulty of keeping a large, restless army fed and focused for months or years outside a target that stubbornly refuses to collapse. There are victories to be had elsewhere. Softer targets, ports without chains across their mouths, towns without triple walls. Sometimes the rational choice is to harass, to threaten, to demand tribute, and then move on, leaving the notion of conquering Constantinople for a better day that never comes. Inside the walls, something different is happening. Survival becomes a habit. The population learns that when an enemy banner appears on the horizon, it is terrifying, yes, but also familiar. There is a protocol. Close the gates, stock the cisterns, bring in as much grain as can be found, inspect the machinery on the walls, the ballistae, the catapults, the hoists and pulleys used to move stones and boiling liquids, check the signal systems along the towers, rotate fresh troops to the most exposed positions, move non-combatants to safer quarters, organize processions to the city's great churches, carrying relics believed to protect the city, reinforcing not just faith, but morale. Byzantine commanders, facing each new threat, mine the past for solutions. They remember how Heraclius' city endured the Persians and Avars, how Leo III used winter and Greek fire against Maslama, how earlier emperors negotiated truces when force was not enough. They experiment too, adding new outworks, repairing earthquake damage with improved techniques, adjusting artillery positions, learning from each attempt, successful or not. Improvisation becomes part of the culture of defense. In one siege, defenders might haul ships overland along the shore to outflank a blockading fleet. In another, they might send out a surprise night attack to burn siege engines before they can be fully assembled. Spies slip into enemy camps, spreading rumors about disease, supply shortages, unfavorable omens. Diplomats work to peel away allies, offering gold, titles, or trade concessions in exchange for neutrality. Over centuries, this combination of stone, strategy, adaptation, and story produces a peculiar kind of confidence. Not the naive belief that nothing bad can ever happen, but a deep-seated assumption that when the crisis comes, the city will endure. After all, it always has. Children grow up hearing about the Avars turned back from the walls, the Arab fleets burned in the straits, the Rus rowing away, defeated not just by weapons, but by something larger, something almost metaphysical. The idea of Constantinople as a city chosen to stand. Outsiders notice this attitude. Some resent it, some respect it, all have to contend with it. By the time we reach the 15th century, there are rulers in Europe and the Middle East who are raised on stories of how their grandfathers and great-grandfathers failed before these walls. The aura of invincibility is not a myth concocted overnight. It is the cumulative weight of 1,000 years of failed sieges, layered over stone like moss, thickening with each retreating army. And yet, beneath that aura, reality is still quietly shifting. The empire behind the walls is not the same powerhouse that once fielded armies from the Danube to the Nile. The defenders' tradition of resilience and improvisation will soon face a test unlike anything their ancestors could have imagined. Because somewhere, beyond the horizon, a young sultan is studying the same history everyone else knows, and asking himself a different question. Not why this city cannot be taken, but what new tools might finally make it possible. The strange thing about long declines is that they don't feel like declines while you're living through them. If you were born in Constantinople in, say, the year 900, you would still see marble colonnades, crowded markets, scholars debating in shaded courtyards, processions winding toward Hagia Sophia under glittering mosaics. You'd hear people speak of the Romans and mean themselves. They'd still call their ruler Basileus of the Romans, emperor of a world that, on parchment and in memory, still stretched from ocean to desert. But if you stood on the walls and looked out, the distances would already be shorter. The empire that had once wrapped around the eastern Mediterranean like a great shining horseshoe had begun to fray. Egypt, once the empire's granary, was gone to the early caliphates. Syria and Palestine, with their ancient cities and wealthy monasteries, were lost as well. North Africa, too. The great coastal arc of Roman blue on old maps had turned into a jagged shoreline of new powers. On paper, Constantinople was still capital of Romania, the Roman world. In reality, the world it ruled was shrinking decade by decade. The process wasn't clean or simple, it never is. It came in waves. In one generation, the empire would be pressed hard by Arab fleets and horsemen from the south and east. In another, it would be steppe nomads or Bulgars or Pechenegs from the north, crossing the Danube, raiding Thrace, or battering frontier fortresses. Sometimes Rome in the east rallied magnificently. An energetic emperor would ride out, reorganize the army, repair fortifications, levy new taxes, and win a string of battles. Borders would expand a little. Chroniclers would breathe easier and talk about restoration. Then, a few decades later, the pendulum would swing back. Even at its best, this was not the easy dominance of earlier centuries. It was more like treading water in a choppy sea, arms always moving, lungs always burning, victory measured not by great leaps forward, but by the fact that you hadn't yet gone under. By the 11th century, new pressures arrived from an unexpected direction. Deep in the interior of Asia, Turkic peoples had been moving westward for centuries. Some were hired as Byzantine mercenaries, others converted to Islam and entered the service of the caliphates, forming the core of a new power that historians call the Seljuk Turks. They were disciplined, mobile, and very good at the kind of steppe-style cavalry warfare that had always given settled empires trouble. For a while, the Byzantines played their usual game of diplomacy and divide and rule. Bribe one group, ally with another, recruit a third. That strategy had worked on Huns and Avars and Bulgars, but this time something else happened. In 1071, outside a town called Manzikert in eastern Anatolia, a Byzantine army met a Seljuk force. The Emperor Romanos IV was there in person. What followed was not just a defeat, but a disaster of cohesion. Miscommunication, mistrust between commanders, possibly outright betrayal, turned a difficult battle into a rout. The emperor was captured, the army fractured. The defeat itself didn't instantly erase Byzantine power. What it did was open a door. In the years that followed, Seljuk warbands and other Turkish groups filtered into the Anatolian plateau, the same region that had been the empire's heartland for centuries. Those upland plains and valleys were where the empire drew much of its tax base, food and soldiers. They were a reservoir of small farmers organised into military districts, the famous themes, who supplied local troops in exchange for land. As those lands were lost or disrupted, the old system faltered. Anatolian cities and fortresses fell or were simply bypassed, their hinterlands swallowed by new emirates. Caravans began to flow along routes that no longer paid tolls to Constantinople. The empire was still rich by many standards, still magnificent in its capital, but the foundations under that glitter were cracking. Inside the palace, the response was not always unity. One of the recurring patterns in Byzantine history is civil war at exactly the wrong moment. Powerful families in the provinces, ambitious generals on the frontiers, ministers at court, all had their own followings and grievances. If one faction thought an emperor weak, or another believed it deserved power more, it might raise its own banner. Armies that should have been defending frontiers ended up fighting each other. Every civil war drained coffers, killed experienced soldiers, and forced emperors to buy peace with tax remissions, land grants, or privileges that weakened central authority in the long run. Sometimes, to gain advantage over rival claimants, a would-be emperor invited foreign powers into internal disputes. Turks, Normans, Venetians, short-term allies, long-term headaches. Financially, the empire was feeling the strain. Debased coinage appeared now and then when emperors stretched the precious metal content to fund wars and buy loyalty. Imperial lands were alienated to aristocrats and monasteries to reward supporters, reducing the tax base. By the time anyone tried to reverse these trends, the habits were deeply entrenched and powerful beneficiaries resisted. And hovering over all of this, like a storm that never quite cleared, was the memory of an event that did more psychological and material damage than almost any foreign invasion: the Fourth Crusade. At the start of the 13th century, Latin Christendom's armies had set out ostensibly to fight Muslims in the Holy Land. Through a tangle of debts, Venetian interests, dynastic intrigues, and opportunism, they ended up diverted to Constantinople instead. In 1203 to 1204, Crusader and Venetian forces attacked the very city they were supposed to be defending in the name of the faith. The walls, once again, were challenged. This time the threat came not from caliphs or sultans, but from fellow Christians speaking related languages, carrying familiar symbols. The attackers combined land assaults with naval operations in the Golden Horn. They used ships with siege towers lashed to their decks, trying to bring wooden structures up to the height of the sea walls. They probed for weak points, capitalized on internal divisions in the city, and eventually, after a tumultuous series of events, broke through. For the first time since its founding, Constantinople fell to a hostile army. What happened next was a catastrophe in slow motion. For 3 days, much of the city was sacked. Churches were looted, relics carried off to western cathedrals, libraries scattered, artworks melted down for their metal. The noise and smoke and fear of those days left deep scars in the city's memory. Politically, the empire splintered. The Crusaders set up their own Latin empire in Constantinople. Byzantine elites fled and established exile states in places like Nicaea and Epirus, each claiming to be the true continuation of the Roman line. For roughly half a century, Constantinople itself was under Latin control. The Latin rulers never had the resources or familiarity with the region to restore what they had broken. They held a shrinking core while surrounding territories were carved up by local powers and rival claimants. Trade patterns shifted, often in ways that favoured Venice and other Italian maritime republics. Key customs revenues that once filled Byzantine treasuries now flowed elsewhere. When a Greek-speaking dynasty finally managed to retake Constantinople in 1261 under Michael VIII Palaiologos, what they found was not the same city that had dazzled earlier generations. The population was smaller. Whole districts lay in ruins or had been cannibalized for building materials. Some of the great monuments still stood, but many were damaged or stripped of their adornments. The empire that the Palaiologoi ruled from their reclaimed capital was a patchwork. A few strongholds in western Anatolia, parts of Thrace, bits of Greece, outlying islands. It was a restoration in name, not in scale. The new emperors faced a daunting equation. They had inherited the symbols of universal empire, crowns, titles, ceremonies, but not the tax base that made those symbols more than theatre. Italian merchants dominated much of the city's long-distance trade, enjoying generous privileges granted in exchange for naval help during difficult times. Customs houses that once filled imperial coffers now offered slim pickings. Defensively, the city still looked formidable from a distance. The Theodosian walls were there, a massive time-darkened band of stone and brick. Hagia Sophia still crowned the skyline. Approaching by sea or land, a 15th-century traveller might still feel the same awe that Arab, Rus or Bulgar envoys had felt centuries earlier. But if you walk through the streets, you might notice empty spaces where houses had once been packed tight, gardens and fields inside the walls where there had once been dense neighbourhoods, sections of fortification patched hastily with brick and rubble instead of solid ashlar, monasteries that doubled as poorhouses because the imperial treasury could not or would not fund broader social support. The empire's army, once an institution that could field tens of thousands of professional troops supported by provincial levies, was now a fraction of that size. Many soldiers were mercenaries, Catalans, Turks, Italians, Serbs. Useful in battle, but expensive and not always loyal beyond the promise of pay. When money ran out, allies sometimes turned into raiders. Internally, politics did not become gentler as the state shrank. The Palaiologan period saw coups, rebellions, family rivalries played out in sieges and street fights. In some civil wars, rival emperors literally hired Ottoman or other Turkish forces to support their claims, trading long-term security for short-term advantage. All the while, to the northwest, a new power was rising from a frontier beylik into a regional giant. The Ottomans. They took city after city in the Balkans and Anatolia, often encircling Byzantine enclaves and leaving them isolated. They learned the geography around Constantinople intimately, absorbing fortified towns that had once formed the outer ring of its defence. By the early 15th century, what called itself the Roman Empire was mostly a memory drawn across a map with shaky lines. A strip of land around Constantinople, parts of the Peloponnese, a scattering of islands and ports held more by diplomacy than by strength, and yet the city at the centre still projected an echo of its old prestige. Foreign ambassadors still knelt before emperors dressed in heavy gold-embroidered robes. Ceremonies still unfolded in ancient palaces, even if the roofs leaked and some halls had been abandoned. Hagia Sophia still drew worshippers, its dome catching the same changing light it had seen for 900 years. From outside, especially in the imagination, Constantinople remained the queen of cities, the place that had turned back caliphs and khans. From inside, for those who knew where to look, it was a queen wearing borrowed jewellery and mended clothes. That contrast between legend and reality mattered. It made the city look, to some rulers, both intimidating and tempting. Intimidating because of the long memory of failure before its walls, tempting because anyone who could finally take it would inherit not just stone and harbour, but the aura of having done what no one else could. The prize was no longer a vast empire, but a symbol that still carried the weight of an empire's name. Among the people looking at Constantinople this way was a young Ottoman ruler, raised on stories of past sieges, aware of both the city's glory and its hollowed-out state. He studied not only the terrain and the walls, but the gaps behind them, the dwindling garrisons, the empty treasury, the fraying alliances. He lived in a world where warfare itself was changing, where new tools were beginning to appear that didn't respect old stone the way arrows and rams had. And in his mind the question was no longer, can this city be taken? But what combination of pressure and technology will finally make the legend yield? He grew up with the walls as a kind of horizon in his mind. If you were Mehmed, the future second of that name, you would have heard about Constantinople long before you saw it. Your tutors and generals used the city as a reference point the way other children might use the moon. Distant, luminous, always there when people wanted to point at something grand or impossible. You would have been told the stories of Arab fleets turned back, of Bulgarian khans withdrawing in frustration, of crusaders who had taken the city only by twisting crusade into civil war. You would have heard how your own grandfather and great-grandfather had brought their armies to its walls, probed them, tested them, forced emperors to pay tribute, and then pulled back again when other priorities called. For an Ottoman prince, the city was a lesson. How stubborn stone and careful diplomacy could keep a hollow empire alive far longer than anyone expected. Mehmed was not born to a tidy, secure throne. He entered a world of competition, succession struggles, and a state that was changing faster than many older men around him could fully grasp. The Ottomans in his youth were no longer just another small frontier beylik fighting over grazing lands. They controlled key trade routes, rich agricultural plains, and some of the most important cities in the Balkans and western Anatolia. Their sultans commanded armies that mixed steppe cavalry traditions with a growing corps of infantry, and they had begun to experiment more seriously with gunpowder weapons. And yet, right in the middle of their lands, almost like a stone caught in the throat, sat Constantinople. Map it out in your mind. Ottoman territories stretched around the city on both the European and Anatolian sides. To move troops from Asia into Europe or from the Balkans back to Anatolia, Ottoman rulers either had to negotiate passage near the city, rely on fleets, or accept delays and detours. Strategically, leaving Constantinople in Byzantine hands was like accepting a fortified island at the centre of your own lake. Politically, the city was even more provocative. The Byzantine emperor by Mehmed's time was no longer the towering figure of earlier centuries, but the title still meant something. Emperor of the Romans carried with it a claim, at least in theory, to universal Christian empire. It was a reminder to Latin princes and kings that there was an older, more senior crown out there, even if its wearer now ruled mostly memories and courtyards. As long as that crown existed, it offered a focal point for coalitions. A hard-pressed emperor in Constantinople could appeal to Venice, to the Pope, to Hungarian kings, to anyone who saw advantage in rescuing the last Roman capital from Muslim encirclement. Sometimes that appeal produced nothing. Sometimes it produced crusading talk or money or fleets. From an Ottoman point of view, the city was both an irritant and a risk, weak enough to be tempting prey, important enough that its suffering might pull in outside powers. There was also the question of prestige. Muslim scholars and storytellers had preserved sayings, some widely accepted, some more doubtful, that spoke of a future conqueror of Constantinople, a leader who would capture the great city and receive divine favour for doing so. Interpretations varied. Some rulers leaned into those prophecies, others treated them as background legend. For a young man like Mehmed, raised on both religious learning and imperial ambition, it was hard not to hear those lines and feel them as a kind of personal dare. He was not the first Ottoman to look at the city with that mixture of piety and calculation. Earlier sultans had made moves against it, tightened the noose, taken surrounding fortresses, even imposed blockades. But circumstances, rivalries, and priorities had always pulled them away. A war in Anatolia, a revolt in the Balkans, a need to keep peace with powerful Christian neighbours. Mehmed absorbed all this. He watched his father Murad II fight long campaigns, win and lose battles against Hungarians, Serbs and other powers. He saw how much effort went into managing fronts that might have been simpler if Constantinople were not there as a stubborn symbolic thorn. He also learned insecurity very young. Murad abdicated at one point, making Mehmed Sultan while he was still a teenager. The experiment did not go well. External threats and internal doubts spiked. Powerful figures at court questioned whether this intense, bookish, occasionally volatile youth was ready to manage an empire balanced between many enemies. Murad returned to the throne. Mehmed was set aside. For many rulers, an early humiliation like that might have left only resentment, or a desire to prove oneself through rash action. In Mehmed's case, it seems to have worked differently. He observed, he studied, he prepared. Sources from his reign describe him surrounded by scholars, geographers, engineers. He read histories, including, it seems, accounts of earlier sieges, both successful and failed. He was fascinated by maps and by the practicalities of power, how food moved, how ships were built, how fortifications were designed. He had a reputation for temper, but also for calculation. People who met him used words that suggested intensity more than impulsiveness. When Murad finally died and Mehmed took the throne again, this time as an adult, he did not rush immediately at the city. Instead, he began to close the net. One of his earliest major moves was the construction of a new fortress on the Bosporus, on the European side, opposite an older Ottoman stronghold. The Byzantines called it the throat cutter. Its purpose was clear: to control sea traffic entering and leaving the strait, and to make it much harder for Constantinople to receive supplies or reinforcements from the Black Sea. Building such a fortress was not just an act of engineering, it was a diplomatic signal. Mehmed was announcing that he intended to treat the city not as a respected neighbour, but as a problem to be solved. He also reorganized his forces. The Ottoman army by this point was not a single unified bloc, but a composite of elements: feudal-style cavalry, paid infantry, irregular fighters, and a growing corps of soldiers raised through the Dev-Sherm system, the Janissaries. Mehmed increased their numbers, tightened their discipline, and made sure they answered directly to him. He invested in logistics, supply depots, roads, arrangements for fodder and grain, because he understood that a siege was not a glorious one-day battle, but a long draining test of endurance. Behind the scenes there was intelligence work. Ottoman agents moved through the region, listening in ports and taverns, talking to merchants, priests and disgruntled nobles. They reported on the state of Constantinople's walls, its garrisons, its food stores, its politics. They noted which Western powers seemed distracted, which were engaged elsewhere, who among the Italian maritime states was at odds with whom. Mehmed did not want to wake up one morning outside the Theodosian walls and discover that a large crusading army had arrived at his flank. He wanted to pick a moment when potential rescuers were divided, hesitant or already overcommitted. Inside the city, the Byzantines could see much of this unfolding. They saw the fortress rise over the Bosporus. They heard about Ottoman military reforms. They sent embassies, offers, pleas. They tried to play old diplomatic games, hinting at union with the Western Church, offering trading privileges, invoking ancient alliances. From their perspective, Mehmed was a young man who might be reasoned with, or at least delayed. From his perspective, they were buying time he had no intention of granting indefinitely. Yet the plan he was assembling was not a simple surround and starve strategy. He knew the city had endured sieges like that before and survived. It could be supplied by sea. It had its own stores. Its walls made direct assault expensive and uncertain. What changed in Mehmed's generation was the appearance of gunpowder artillery that could plausibly challenge walls that had laughed off earlier machines. Siege towers could be burned, ramps could be broken, arrows and stones might be shrugged off by layered masonry. But heavy cannon promised something different: the slow, relentless unmaking of stone. The new sultans sought out specialists, foreign gunners, metal workers, engineers willing to design and cast larger and more powerful bombards than the region had yet seen. He was not content to rely on small field pieces used mainly to frighten cavalry. He wanted weapons designed specifically to batter fortifications. Commissioning such artillery required investment and foresight. The casting of massive bronze cannons took time, resources, and specialized knowledge. Transporting them over land demanded roads, draft animals, and planning. They were temperamental machines that could crack, misfire, or explode. Integrating them into a siege was not a matter of wheeling them up and firing away, but of preparing platforms, ammunition supplies, and trained crews. Mehmed committed to this, even while knowing that success was not guaranteed. In that sense, the coming siege would be a gamble. But it was not the kind of gamble you make at a moment of desperation, throwing dice on a last chance. It was the sort of calculated risk you take when you believe you have stacked the odds as far as possible in your favour. Around all of this hung ideas of destiny. In Ottoman court culture, poets and scholars began to hint, more and more openly, that their young ruler might be the one whom earlier sayings had described, the conqueror of the great city, the fulfiller of long-whispered prophecies. Some genuinely believed this. Others saw the value in encouraging it. Either way, it wrapped Mehmed's strategic ambition in a cloak of religious and symbolic meaning. Conquering Constantinople would not just make the empire's map look cleaner. It would make a statement to subjects and rivals alike, that the Ottomans were not merely inheritors of steppe traditions or regional overlords, but claimants to a broader, almost universal kind of authority. If you were Mehmed standing in your palace in Edirne, looking westward in your mind, you might feel all these strands at once. The irritation of a hostile fortress in the middle of your domains, the lure of controlling the straits that connected Black Sea grain and trade to the Mediterranean, the prestige of taking the queen of cities where others had failed, the murmur of prophecy calling some future leader blessed for doing what you were already planning to attempt, and beneath it all, a conviction that this would not be an impulsive charge at legend, but the culmination of years of preparation, of fortresses raised, cannons cast, alliances measured, weaknesses studied. When at last he moved, it would seem sudden to many watching. But for Mehmed himself, the decision to march on Constantinople was less a leap into the unknown than the next, necessary step in a project he had been building silently for most of his life. Imagine walking through Mehmed's foundries in the months before the siege. The air would be thick with smoke and the sharp metallic tang of heated bronze. Men move like shadows between furnaces, faces streaked black with soot, bodies slick with sweat. Somewhere in this organized chaos stands a man whose name will be remembered in countless later stories, a master founder often called Urban or Orban. We don't have a full biography for him. Different sources give somewhat different accounts. Some later writers say he was Hungarian, others suggest he might have been from one of the Balkan regions. What most agree on is that he was a specialist in casting large guns, and that he first approached the Byzantines, offering his skills to the emperor behind those ancient walls. According to one oft-repeated story, the Byzantines listened politely, asked questions, and then admitted they could not pay what he wanted. Their treasury was strained, their manpower limited, their gold had more urgent places to go. So Orban left the city he might one day help destroy, and made his way to Mehmed's court instead. Whether every detail of that tale is precise or not, it captures an important truth. By the mid-15th century, gunpowder technology had become a market. Founders, gunners, and engineers could move between employers. States that could pay well and plan ahead would attract the best talent. Mehmed was determined to be one of those states. When Orban, or men very much like him, reached Edirne and laid out their designs, Mehmed did not hesitate. Money, materials, labour. He promised them all. He wanted a new kind of weapon, something that could do what rams, towers, and catapults had never quite managed against the Theodosian walls. To understand why this mattered, it helps to think about what old-fashioned siege warfare looked like. For most of the city's long history, attackers had relied on a familiar toolkit: wooden towers rolled toward the walls, battering rams pushed up under protective sheds, sappers digging tunnels to undermine foundations, stone-throwing engines launching rocks, fire pots, and debris. All of it was dangerous. All of it could be deadly. But the walls of Constantinople were designed with those threats in mind. Towers could be set on fire, ramps could be cut or collapsed, rams could be smashed by stones dropped from above, tunnels could be countermined. As long as defenders had enough people, supplies, and willpower, they could meet most of these techniques with countermeasures honed over centuries. Gunpowder artillery introduced something less familiar: sustained, high-energy impact on the same spot of a wall, over and over again, from a distance the defenders could not easily reach. These weren't the small hand cannons or light field pieces that had been creeping into European and Middle Eastern battlefields. Mehmed wanted bombards, huge bronze tubes capable of hurling stone balls heavier than a man across hundreds of meters. One of the great cannons associated with the siege was said to be so large that it took a team of oxen and hundreds of men to move it. Contemporary accounts talk about stone projectiles weighing several hundred kilograms being fired with charges carefully measured out of small scoops to avoid bursting the barrel. Firing such a gun was not like squeezing a trigger. It was more like performing a dangerous ritual. First, the interior of the barrel had to be cleaned and swabbed. Then a precisely measured amount of powder was poured in and tamped down. Wadding and a stone ball followed, pushed with effort into place. The barrel had to be aimed, adjusted with wedges and levers. Only then, with everyone standing back as far as they dared, would the fuse be lit. When it fired, witnesses said, the sound rolled over the countryside like thunder. Whole sections of wall shuddered under the impact. Dust and fragments flew. In nearby villages, windows rattled. People miles away marked the hour by the dull, distant boom. In stories told afterward, that cannon can sound almost mythical, as if it alone broke a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years. Reality, as usual, is more complicated. Those giant guns were impressive, but they were also clumsy, temperamental machines. They needed massive wooden platforms just to sit level. Recoil could crack their mountings. Metal fatigued under repeated stress. Firing them too often risked explosions that would kill their own crews. Reloading took time. Some sources suggest the largest pieces could only be fired a few times a day without risk. They were, in other words, siege tools, not magical city killers. What they could do, however, was something that earlier technologies had struggled with: methodically weaken a chosen section of an elite fortification, day after day, in a way that accumulated without giving defenders much chance to repair under fire. You can picture how this changed the geometry of an assault. In earlier centuries, defenders behind the Theodosian walls could trust that the stone itself was, in some deep way, on their side. Towers and curtains had been built thick enough to shrug off most conventional strikes. Even if a battering ram managed to knock loose some blocks, you needed sustained close contact to force a breach. That meant getting under arrow fire, stone drops, burning oil. Attackers suffered long before the wall did. Artillery flipped part of that equation. Now the main work of erosion could happen at a distance. Each hit gouged a little more, shook a little more rubble loose, cracked a little farther into the mortar. Defenders could try to shore up the inner face, build earthen ramps behind weak spots, or drape hides and timbers to absorb some force. But the basic reality was new. Stone that had felt immutable began to behave like something that could be worn down, like a tooth slowly drilled by patient pressure. Still, the bombards alone were not enough. For one thing, their accuracy was limited. Early cannon were not precision instruments. Even with practiced gunners, slight shifts in elevation or powder quality could send shots high, low, or askew. To make them effective, Mehmed did not rely on just one or two great monsters. He assembled a whole train of artillery, large pieces for heavy blows, smaller guns that could be moved and adjusted more easily, all coordinated to keep stretching the defender's attention. This was a system, not a single invention. Behind every shot lay the work of miners extracting saltpeter and sulphur, charcoal burners tending their fires, powder makers grinding ingredients in the right ratios. Bronze had to be smelted and alloyed to the right hardness. Carts and oxen had to drag tubes weighing tons across rough ground. Engineers had to select firing positions, level them, and calculate ranges. Mehmed invested in that entire chain. He didn't just buy a famous cannon. He built, or at least expanded, an organizational machine that could feed and maintain a siege artillery park. That's part of why historians, looking back, talk about this campaign as a turning point, not just because there were big guns, but because those guns were embedded in a vision of war that treated logistics and engineering as seriously as courage and prayer. On the other side, the defenders adapted as best they could. When cannonballs struck, they rushed to fill craters with earth, rubble and timber, creating thick, shock-absorbing mounds behind the outer face. When a tower was cracked, they braced it from within. They learned which sounds meant a misfire, which meant a hit in a vulnerable place. Night after night, teams worked by lamplight, sweating as they shoved carts of earth to the weakest points, knowing that at dawn the guns would open up again. It was a grim rhythm: fire, collapse, repair, fire again. This is where persistence mattered as much as technology. A few days of bombardment, even with the largest guns, might not have broken these walls. The city had seen frightening machines before and outlasted them. What made the difference in 1453 was not just the shock of the first shots, but the Ottoman capacity to keep going, to supply powder, to keep crews at their posts, to shift guns when needed, to coordinate artillery with assaults, sapping, and pressure along multiple sectors. Over time, patterns emerge. Certain stretches of the wall begin to look more tired than others. A tower leans just a little, its footing undermined by repeated impact. The outer wall, already lower than the main inner rampart, starts to crumble in places. Each fresh breach becomes an invitation, a place where, with enough courage and numbers, attackers might rush in and try to claw their way through before defenders can plug the gap. In that sense, the famous cannon did change the balance, not by single-handedly smashing a proud city in one dramatic blast, but by shifting psychology and possibility. For the first time, it was clear that even these walls, icons of impregnability, could be physically dismantled by human hands directing gunpowder force. The stories that had once protected Constantinople, that no engine could batter down its defences, began to sound less certain each time stone dust billowed into the air. At the same time, the siege showed the limits of technology on its own. The Ottomans still had to dig trenches, build earthworks, throw up their own protective walls against sorties and arrows. They still had to coordinate infantry assaults, manage disease, keep morale steady. The cannons were powerful, but without the thousands of ordinary soldiers willing to stand under those same walls, to climb, to fill ditches, to die in failed attacks, the guns would only have left pockmarks in stone. Seen from a distance, this is one of those moments when an old world and a new one overlap. Behind the battlements, Byzantine defenders relied on practices that had served them for centuries: disciplined archery, careful use of reserves, night repairs, faith in God and the strength of their ramparts. Beyond the trenches, an Ottoman ruler bet on a future in which walls everywhere would have to be reimagined if they were to survive. The bombards of 1453 did not make medieval fortifications instantly obsolete. Many cities continued to rely on high walls for decades. But they did send a clear warning. The age when masonry alone could guarantee safety was ending. For now, though, the question was immediate and personal. With artillery dug in and the first serious cracks appearing in the Theodosian system, the siege moved from preparation to open test. Mehmed had brought his cannons to the city that had once seemed untouchable. The thunder of their firing was the sound of that confidence being challenged, stone by stone. Soon, it would no longer be enough to stand behind the walls and trust the past. Both sides were about to find out what happened when old defences met new fire, not in theory, but in the dust and confusion of a real, relentless siege. Dawn comes pale and cool over the Marmara, but the city is already awake. It is April 1453, and for people inside Constantinople, the world has been shrinking day by day. First, there were the rumours, reports brought by riders from the countryside. Villages emptied, fields abandoned, Ottoman detachments moving like a slow tide around the land walls, surveying, measuring distances, driving stakes into the ground. Ships sighted along the coast, more than usual, their silhouettes hovering at the edge of vision. Then one morning watchers on the towers look west and see something different. Not scattered camps, not raiding parties, but an army. Lines of men, banners, tents, supply wagons. Artillery being dragged into position with straining oxen. Fresh earth turning under spades as trenches take shape. The hills that had once seemed simply part of the landscape now begin to fill with purposeful movement. The noose is closing. On the seaside, the picture changes as well. The Ottoman fleet is not, by later standards, enormous. But to the defenders looking out from the sea walls over the Golden Horn and the open water, it feels like the horizon itself has grown teeth. Galleys with banks of oars, smaller vessels crowding around larger ones, masts rising in a forest of spars and rigging. The chain that guards the entrance to the Golden Horn is in place, stretched heavy and silent across the water, anchored to towers on each side. For now it holds. Ottoman ships hover outside, testing positions, gauging currents, watching. It is in this tightening ring that we should place one man in particular, Constantine XI Palaiologos, last emperor of Byzantium. He is not a figure shrouded in mythical power. By 1453 the imperial court is no longer the glittering centre of a vast Mediterranean empire. The purple robes, the elaborate ceremonies, the old theological disputes that once animated halls of marble and gold, these still exist in some form, but they sit uneasily atop a reality of shortages and compromises. Constantine is, in many ways, a working monarch of a shrunken state. He has bargained with Italian republics for ships and loans. He has written letters to Western rulers asking for help, invoking shared faith, shared history, shared interests. He has toured the walls, listened to engineers, met with clergy. He knows the city's resources. He knows its weaknesses. He also knows, or at least strongly suspects, that no large relieving army is marching to his aid. When modern writers imagine him in these days, they often picture a man moving constantly, from council chamber to gatehouse, from chapel to bastion, encouraging, inspecting, making choices that all boil down to a single grim calculation. How long can we hold? The numbers are not encouraging. Estimates vary, and sources from the time do not agree on exact figures, but most modern historians think that, within the walls, the total number of people capable of bearing arms is somewhere in the low thousands. Perhaps around 7,000 defending soldiers, maybe a bit more if one includes every armed citizen who can be mustered. Of those, only a portion are professional troops. Facing them, on land and sea, Mehmed has brought tens of thousands. Again, the exact numbers differ by account. Some chronicles give enormous figures that are probably exaggerated, others are more modest. But regardless of which you trust, the basic ratio is clear. The Ottomans outnumber the defenders by many times over. It would be easy to imagine this as a simple story of a doomed city waiting passively behind its walls. But Constantinople in April 1453 is not passive. One of the reasons it can still stand at all is because it is not defended only by its native citizens. In the months before the siege, foreign volunteers began to arrive. From the Italian city-states in particular came men who understood both commerce and war, and whose governments had long, complicated relationships with Byzantium. The most famous of these is a Genoese captain named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He is not a romantic knight-errant riding in on a solitary horse. He brings with him several hundred experienced soldiers, many of them specialists in defending fortifications. They come equipped, organised, familiar with gunpowder, crossbows and close quarters fighting on walls. Giustiniani and his men have their own motivations: personal honour, the possibility of reward, the defence of Christian interests against a rising Muslim power, the protection of trading rights. It's likely a mixture of all these, blended with the calculations of Genoa itself, a republic that must balance immediate profit with longer-term strategic concerns. When Constantine and Giustiniani meet, their destinies become intertwined. The emperor, understanding the tactical reality, places immense trust in this foreign captain. Giustiniani is given command of the most critical sector, the land walls near the Lycus Valley, where the terrain and the configuration of the Theodosian system make a concentrated attack most likely. Here, the outer and inner walls, the moat, the towers, all the layers that earlier centuries had tested and failed to overcome, will once again be asked to do their work, and here Giustiniani's experience will matter most. Inside the city, the defending force is a patchwork. There are Byzantine regulars, disciplined but few. There are armed citizens, some with armour passed down for generations, others with little more than a helmet and a spear. There are foreign contingents, Venetians, other Italians, perhaps a few from further west, each with their own command structures and loyalties. There are monks and priests who will serve as medics, spiritual support, and sometimes fighters in emergencies. Coordination will be constant work. So will morale. As Mehmed's trenches creep closer and his batteries settle into place, a new sound begins to define the days and nights, the measured boom of artillery testing its range. The first serious bombardments are as much psychological as physical. Gunners adjust their positions, firing a few rounds, watching where the balls strike, recalibrating. The great siege guns, including the enormous bombard that Orban and others helped cast, are dragged into the places chosen for them. Behind each one, engineers and officers confer, making sure platforms are solid, that supplies of powder and shot are near to hand. When the Ottoman artillery finally opens in earnest, the effect is jarring. For centuries, the worst sound a defender on these walls might hear during a siege was the crack of rams against a gate, the grinding roar of a siege tower, the whine and crash of giant stones flung by torsion engines. Now there is something deeper, more regular. The sky does not fall at once. The first volleys chip, gouge, spoil pieces of masonry away. They send showers of stone and dust inward, startling men at the parapets, forcing them to duck behind merlons. Sometimes the balls strike at odd angles and glance off. Sometimes they land short or long, carving craters in the outer ditches. But certain patterns quickly become clear. Sections of the outer wall that are slightly lower, slightly more exposed, begin to take more hits. A tower that commands a key approach becomes a favourite target. Each impact loosens mortar, drives micro-fractures through blocks, shakes rubble out of joints. From the Ottoman lines, this looks like progress. From the walls, it feels like a slow, grinding test of endurance. Defenders rush to respond. Under Giustiniani's direction, and with Constantine's approval, engineers and labourers start building inner buttresses of earth and timber behind the most threatened spots. Men with shovels and baskets move ceaselessly, filling gaps, tamping down soil. Others pile up sacks, stones, anything that can absorb a portion of the shock. The rhythm of the city changes. Days are defined by the tempo of the gunfire. Periods of intense bombardment alternate with quieter hours used for hurried repair. Nights, once given over to rest and prayer, now echo with the creak of wagons carrying earth and stones to the ramparts, with the scrape of tools against tired masonry. Food is rationed more strictly. Powder and arrows are counted. Every casualty matters. The imbalance in manpower lies behind every decision. Mehmed can rotate his troops. Units that spend the morning digging trenches or taking their turn at the forward lines can be pulled back to rest while others take their place. Fresh men arrive from the hinterland, bringing news and sometimes supplies. Inside the city, there is nowhere to rotate to. Every man taken from the walls to rest leaves a gap someone else must fill. Every barrel of grain used cannot be replaced. Every length of timber used to shore up a breach is one less for later emergencies. Even hope is a finite resource. There are still rumours of aid from the west. There are prayers, processions, solemn liturgies asking for divine intervention. Church bells mark the hours. Priests preach endurance and faith. Some people cling to prophecies that say the city will be saved at the last moment. Others, more pragmatic, focus on today's tasks. Carry this stone, mend that parapet, smother that fire. From Mehmed's perspective, this is the opening phase going more or less according to plan. His guns have begun to make their mark. His fleet watches the harbours. His engineers chart the contours of the defences. His scribes and officers keep track of supplies, casualties, progress. He knows that a single storm, a sudden outbreak of disease, or a major defeat in a frontal assault could complicate everything. But he also knows something crucial. Time tends to favour the side with deeper reserves. As April days lengthen and the first warmth of spring touches the fields beyond the walls, the siege settles into a kind of harsh routine. Stone answers stone, gun answers gun. The defenders strain to hold a line that has withstood so much already. The attackers apply pressure wherever they can, probing for weakness, testing not just mortar and masonry, but the ability of a city with too few people and too little food to keep standing under constant, patient fire. As the days pass, the siege stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a weather pattern. The guns are the thunder. They fire, not constantly, but often enough that silence itself begins to feel suspicious. A lull might mean the Ottomans are shifting batteries, or bringing up fresh powder, or aiming at some new, more vulnerable place. The men on the walls learn to expect the next boom before it comes, counting the seconds without quite realising it. Morning bombardments are the worst. Damp air, lingering mist, and then the low, distant thud from across the fields. A brief pause, then the hiss and whine of heavy stone or metal travelling through air. The crash as it slams into the outer wall, the spray of debris, the sudden shouts from nearby towers, counting damage, calling for stretchers. At first, the walls absorb it with a kind of indifferent dignity. These stones have known generations of weather and war. They've been patched and rebuilt before. New mortar glues old blocks. Some sections date back to the 5th century, others are the result of repairs only a few decades old. The Theodosian system is not a single uniform structure. It's a layered, living thing. Bombardment reveals those layers. Under repeated impact, certain spots start to look tired. Mortar crumbles, facing stones loosen, slumping slightly out of alignment. The moat fills slowly with fallen blocks, chips, powdered dust. Each new hit bites into damage already done, carving it deeper. The Ottomans focus on these places. Their gunners mark where the wall flinches most. They adjust the angle, tweak the powder charge. They're not trying to obliterate the entire circuit at once. They're trying to grind a few sections into submission. Inside, the rhythm of the defence tightens. At dawn, men take their positions on the ramparts, eyes stinging from too little sleep. Some have spent part of the night hauling earth, others on patrol, watching for sudden escalades under cover of darkness. Now they stand behind merlons, crossbows loaded, match cords smouldering for the few handguns available, waiting to answer fire with fire. When the guns hit, dust blooms up in choking clouds. Sometimes it falls like a grey curtain over the parapets, coating armour, sticking to sweat. Men cough, spit grit, blink through stinging eyes. If the shot has merely gouged stone, they stay where they are, wiping their faces on sleeves, calling to each other to check for wounded. If the shot has smashed through the outer wall and sent rubble spilling into the ditch, new orders come. Messengers race along the walkways, shouting over the echo of impacts. Runners go down into the streets, into the courtyards, into the half-ruined houses leaning up against the inner walls, summoning labourers, boys, old men, anyone who can carry a basket or push a wheelbarrow. This is the daily pattern now. Under Giustiniani's direction, the most battered stretches are turned into construction sites. The defenders fight with one hand and build with the other. In the hours between bombardments, men shovel earth from open spaces behind the walls, gardens, unused plots, even the upper layers of some streets. They carry it in baskets, sacks, anything they can improvise. Others pry up paving stones from less vital areas to use as fill. Timber is scavenged from damaged houses and empty warehouses. Beams become braces. Doors become palisades, furniture is broken up for revetments. Whenever a section of outer wall has been chewed low enough that a future assault seems likely there, they pile earth behind it, creating a sloping ramp. It looks crude compared to the original masonry, but earth is surprisingly resilient under impact. A cannonball that shatters dressed stone will often bury itself in a packed earthen bank with far less damage. The defenders are, in effect, building new walls behind the old, improvised but functional. Much of this work happens at night. When darkness falls, the guns quiet down, both because aiming is harder and because Ottoman crews need rest and maintenance. But the quiet is not peace, it's opportunity. As soon as full darkness covers the city, work parties move out. Torches are kept low, shaded when possible. Voices are hushed. Men with lanterns pick their way along broken ramparts, stepping over fallen stones, weaving among shattered merlons. Behind them come chains of labourers, passing baskets, dragging timbers, pushing carts that squeak and groan under their loads. Every night, the same kind of decisions have to be made. Where is the damage worst? Which breach must be addressed first? How much manpower can be spared from one sector without leaving another too thinly held? Constantine and Justiniani confer with local commanders, engineers, trusted citizens. They have sketches, mental maps, memories of each day's bombardment. They send men where the wall is closest to giving way. Sometimes they repair the outer layer of masonry enough to maintain the appearance of height. Sometimes they give up on that illusion and focus entirely on raising the inner earthwork, creating a new line of defense that an attacker will only fully see when already under fire. Each night's work eats into the city. More stone stripped from old buildings, more timber removed from roofs and frameworks, more labour drawn from people who already spent the day on the ramparts. Sleep becomes a luxury. Food even more so. Supplies were never abundant when the siege began. As weeks pass, they tighten. Granaries that once fed a capital now serve a beleaguered garrison, and a civilian population trapped behind stone. Rations are cut. Bread grows coarser, stretched with whatever flour substitutes can be found. Barley, peas, sometimes ground seeds or husks. Meat is rare except on special occasions. Horses not vital for defence become potential food. Oil is measured out carefully. Even firewood has to be conserved, though nights on the walls can be bitterly cold and damp. People endure it because they have little choice, and because the city still feels like a shield. As long as the walls stand, there is a boundary between order and whatever waits outside. But endurance isn't just physical, it's also mental. Fear moves through the streets as steadily as the work parties. Rumours find gaps the way water finds cracks in masonry. Someone claims to have seen a section of wall ready to collapse. Someone else whispers that the Ottomans are digging tunnels under the landward defences and will explode mines any day now. Others speak of secret negotiations, imagined betrayals, prophecies that predict disaster on a certain date. Constantine and the leaders of the defence know they have to meet not just stone with stone, but fear with meaning. Inside churches, chapels, and even in hastily cleared rooms near the walls, religious life intensifies. Priests and monks organise processions that move through the darkened streets, carrying relics, icons, candles. They chant litanies, sing hymns, offer prayers for protection. People follow them, some barefoot, some weeping, some just walking in silence, because being among others feels safer than being alone. These rituals do several things at once. They reaffirm identity, the sense that Constantinople is not just a city, but a Christian city, a place believed by many inhabitants to be under special divine care. They create a shared narrative, that suffering has purpose, that endurance is itself a form of faith. and they give structure to days that might otherwise blur into an endless cycle of noise and dust. In some accounts, the emperor himself participates visibly. Constantine attends services, prays with others, shows himself on the walls, speaks to soldiers as near equals in danger. He has no vast reserves to promise, no great army marching to relieve them, but he can offer something else. The sight of a ruler who has chosen to share their fate rather than flee. Leadership in this context is partly about making decisions on where to place cannons and how to allocate grain, but it's also about walking the line between grim realism and crushing despair. He cannot pretend that the situation is good. Everyone can see the crumbling stone, the thinning ranks, the long chains of wounded being carried back from the battlements. But he can encourage the belief that each day held is meaningful, that every morning when the city still stands is a victory of a sort. Meanwhile, Giustiniani works on a different kind of morale. He drills his men, rotates them as much as limited numbers allow, enforces discipline on the walls. He organizes sorties, small, sudden attacks out through postern gates or broken sally ports aimed at Ottoman trenches and gun positions. These sorties are dangerous. They mean leaving the relative security of high stone and running across ground under enemy observation. But when timed well, they can have outsized effects. A group of defenders dashes out at dawn, using the low sun to blind gunners. They rush a battery that's been hammering a vulnerable tower. In minutes they spike cannon, burn wagons, kill or drive off crews, then race back up the slope before larger Ottoman forces can respond. From inside the city, such moments are like sudden clearings in a storm. For a day or two, that particular gun falls silent. Stories of the exploit spread quickly. People repeat the names of those who went out and came back. They remember that, even outnumbered, they are not purely passive. They can still hurt the besiegers, but each sortie also costs. Men are wounded, sometimes fatally. Weapons are lost. And there is always the risk that a gate left open for too long will become an accidental invitation. So the defenders live in tension. They need aggression to break the monotony of being battered. They need caution to avoid catastrophic mistakes. They have to trust commanders who make calls about when to risk lives and when to hold tight behind stone. All the while, the artillery keeps its own relentless schedule. Some days the guns concentrate on one sector, until the stones there seem to shudder with every impact. Other days shots are more scattered, probing for new weak points. Rain or high winds can slow the pace, but as long as powder and shot last, the bombardment never really stops for long. The walls remarkably continue to fulfill their function. They do not collapse at once. They do not crumble like sand. They deform, absorb, adapt through the work of the people inside. Breaches that might have doomed a less prepared or less determined garrison are turned into earthen bastions overnight. Towers that lose their upper stories become platforms for smaller guns or archers. Gaps are closed with timber palisades and makeshift ramparts. The ancient masonry was never meant to face this kind of weapon, yet with human hands constantly patching, reinforcing, and improvising, it still denies Mehmed the quick breakthrough he might have hoped for. Every day that the Ottomans fire and do not get in is another day that disease might spread in their crowded camps, that tempers might fray, that distant rivals might move against Mehmed's interests elsewhere. Inside the city, though, each day also drains something. Another barrel of grain opened, another stack of arrows diminished, another list of names read in quiet corners, men who will not take their turn on the wall again. Still, the line holds, not because the stones are invulnerable, but because thousands of tired, hungry, frightened human beings continue to climb those stairways, stand on those ramparts and work in the rubble after dark, patching, praying, cursing, hoping. The defences of Constantinople in these weeks are no longer just an old Roman engineering project. They are a living, exhausted project of survival, renewed every night, tested every day, under the unblinking gaze of an army and the steady, impersonal pressure of gunpowder and stone. On the land walls, danger is loud and visible. On the water, for a while, it feels far away. From the ramparts that look north toward the Golden Horn, defenders see not fields and trenches and artillery, but a long sheltered inlet pale under the sky, cupped between the old city and the hills of Galata. And across its mouth, drawn from shore to shore like a line in a story, lies one of Constantinople's oldest protections, a chain, not a single delicate length of metal you could wrap around your wrist, but a massive assembly of iron links as heavy as small anvils, resting on great wooden floats and anchored to fortified towers at each end. It looks almost simple, yet for centuries it has done something that no fleet of patrol boats managed as reliably. It has turned the Golden Horn from an open harbour into a locked box. In earlier sieges, that line of iron was enough to keep enemy ships out of the city's safest waters. The Horn was where Byzantine fleets sheltered, where merchant vessels unloaded grain and oil, where the city's naval strength could gather under the protection of walls and towers. If invaders wanted to bring their galleys into that inner harbour, they had to deal with the chain. They could try to smash it. Very difficult. They could try to haul it up. Hard to do while people on the towers are shooting at you, so most simply stayed outside. In 1453 the defenders still trust it. They don't have a great imperial fleet anymore, only a modest collection of Byzantine and allied ships. But those vessels sit inside the Golden Horn like birds in a protected cove, masts clustered, hulls rocking gently, safe behind that iron barrier. On the far side, beyond the chain, the Ottoman navy waits. Not as vast as Mehmed's land army, but impressive nonetheless. War galleys with banks of oars, smaller support craft, transports. Commanders who have spent lives at sea. Crews used to the restless shallow waters of the Aegean and the Black Sea. They patrol the entrance to the Bosporus, they watch the sea walls, they try to cut the city off from any help that might still attempt the risky approach by water. For the besieged city, the sea is both threat and last hope. Everyone knows that if a substantial relief fleet arrived, Venetian, Genoese, some combination of Italian and other Christian ships, it could bring food, men, perhaps even enough naval power to challenge the blockade. Rumours of such fleets travel faster than wind. A merchant claims to have heard that galleys are being fitted out in Venice. A sailor swears that an armada has already left Chios. Messengers from the Morea or from the islands arrive with scraps of news, some true, some distorted by distance and fear. Days pass. The sky remains empty. Then one morning, watchers on the towers do see sails. A small convoy, not a mighty armada. A handful of Christian ships, loaded with grain and supplies, trying to slip into the city. They have to run a gauntlet. Ottoman galleys angle to intercept, oars digging hard. Crews shout, drums beat time. The sea between them foams with the churn of blades. From the walls, people crowd to see, straining their eyes. If those ships make it through, there will be food, powder, maybe even a symbolic sense that the outside world has not forgotten them completely. Accounts differ on every detail, the wind that day, the exact manoeuvres, but most agree on the essentials. The relieving ships are heavier, taller, deep-hulled merchantmen adapted for carrying cargo, not for sleek manoeuvre. The Ottoman galleys are lower, faster, designed to ram and board with swarms of soldiers. Wind and luck matter. Gusts catch the Christian sails at the right moment. Their captains know that if they hesitate, they die, so they drive their ships forward, straight for the narrow lane near the chain. Ottoman galleys close in, but high-sided hulls are hard to seize when defenders on deck are armed and desperate. Arrows fly. Crossbow bolts punch down into rowing benches. Men on the Byzantine side hurl whatever they have, stones, javelins, even burning materials, to keep grappling hooks from finding purchase. From the city, people see ships pass under the shadow of the walls within bowshot. They hear the roar of voices, the crack of artillery from both sides, and then, almost unbelievably, those loaded vessels slip behind the iron barrier into the safety of the Golden Horn. The chain has done its job. For a moment, morale swells. It is proof that the sea blockade is not perfect, that determined ships can still reach the city, that the Great Water Barrier and its ancient iron lock are more than just symbols. On the other side, in the Ottoman camp and aboard Ottoman ships, the scene looks very different. Mehmed has just watched his navy fail to stop a small group of enemy vessels from entering the city's inner harbour right under the eyes of his army. For a young ruler conscious of prestige and authority, it stings. The chain across the Golden Horn is now more than a physical obstacle. It is an insult. It says, "You may hammer the land walls with cannon and surround us with tents and palisades, but this part of the city is still ours." Mehmed begins to consider how to remove that message. He can't simply sail into the Horn. The chain prevents it. He can't easily land troops in Galata and seize the Genoese quarter that controls the northern end of the chain. That would risk a separate conflict with people he would rather keep neutral or quietly cooperative. So he thinks differently. Not around the chain in the water, but around the water entirely. Later chroniclers will describe his plan in ways that make it sound almost like a magician's trick. Move ships on land. The idea is simple to state and terrible to execute. Between the Bosporus and the inner reaches of the Golden Horn there are hills and ridges, scattered with houses, gardens, vineyards, the outskirts of Galata. No convenient canal, no smooth artificial slipway. Yet if ships could somehow be brought out of the Bosporus, hauled up and over those slopes, and slid back down into the calm waters of the Horn above the chain, the city's safe harbour would no longer be safe. How exactly it was done is debated in its details, but a broad picture emerges. Ottoman labourers and engineers prepare a route, a rough road over the hills, cleared and, where possible, smoothed. Timber is brought up, logs cut into rollers and planks. Animal fat, oil or grease may have been used to reduce friction. Ropes and tackle are readied. Oxen, men, perhaps both together, are organised into hauling teams. Then, over the course of a night and a day, some accounts say mainly in darkness, the operation begins. Galleys are brought close to shore, lightened as much as possible. They are cradled on wooden frames, then inched and dragged up from the water, prows scraping, hulls groaning. Once on the prepared path, they ride on rollers, pulled by sweating men and animals, guided by shouts and signals, stabilized with ropes. From inside the city, people may first realize something is happening when they see, not on the waves, but above the line of the northern hill, the tops of masts slowly appearing in places where no masts should be. The mind takes a moment to make sense of it. Ships belong on water. Here they seem to be gliding over earth, propelled by some strange will. By the time the defenders on the walls fully grasp what they're seeing, some Ottoman galleys are already descending the far side of the slope, toward the upper Golden Horn, beyond the reach of the old chain. When their hulls meet the water, splashes echo across the harbour. Now, instead of an empty inner sea with only friendly or neutral ships, there are hostile vessels anchored along the northern shore of the Horn, under cover of Ottoman guns emplaced on nearby ridges. The practical consequences are immediate. The defenders can no longer treat the Golden Horn as a sheltered backyard. Any ships moving there, any attempt to shift men or supplies by boat along the city's own waterfront, now takes place under the threat of Ottoman naval attack from inside the harbour. Artillery that had been focused mostly on the land walls must be redistributed. Small cannons and heavier bombards are dragged to the sea-facing ramparts of the Horn. Men who might have reinforced Giustiniani's battered sectors now have to stand watch on walls that had earlier seemed safer. The chain is still there, heavy and intact, but it guards only the mouth of a harbour that has been partially compromised from above. Psychologically, the blow is even heavier than the added guns and ships suggest. The chain was a piece of the city's story. People told their children that with those walls and that harbour and that iron barrier, the capital had withstood 1,000 storms of war. It was part of what made Constantinople feel inviolable, uniquely protected both by engineering and by providence. To watch ships appear inside the Horn without that chain having been cut is to see a cherished certainty dissolve. If iron links that had stopped fleets for centuries can be sidestepped in a single daring manoeuvre, what else might no longer hold? Commanders inside the city understand the new geometry at once. Before, the siege pressed hardest on the land walls. The sea walls, and especially those along the Golden Horn, were important but secondary, shielded by distance and the chain. Now the siege widens. Arrows and shot can come from new angles. Ottoman guns across the Horn can rake stretches of wall that were once relatively quiet. Small-scale assaults by boat become a possibility. Defenders must stretch thin lines even further along parapets that were never designed to face sustained artillery fire. Work parties that once focused almost entirely on earthen ramps and battered towers in the west now have to reinforce sea-facing sections, build new parapets, and place guns where only lookouts once stood. The fortress city that for so long relied on a few great strengths, its land walls, its harbour, its chain, suddenly feels as if one of its pillars has cracked. The cannons on the land side have not stopped, but from this point in the siege the sound of oars creaking in the waters of the Golden Horn, the sight of foreign flags inside what was once a private inland sea, add a new layer of unease. Constantinople is no longer merely ringed. It is being entered, probed, encircled in 3 dimensions, forced to divide attention between earth and water, between old certainties and a young sultan's willingness to break patterns that had held for centuries. By late April, the siege has settled into a grim routine. By day, cannon. By night, something quieter, more unsettling. Men with picks. Away from the roaring bombards and the visible spectacle of ships in the Golden Horn, another battle begins beneath the earth itself. The idea is as old as walled cities. If stone is too thick to smash from the outside, you go under it. Ottoman engineers and labourers, many of them specialists brought from the Balkans and Anatolia, begin opening shafts near the most stubborn sections of the Theodosian walls. They work from behind their own lines, screened by earthworks and wooden palisades, starting in shallow trenches and then disappearing underground. They dig galleries that inch toward the foundations of towers and curtain walls. The aim is simple in principle and deadly in practice. Reach the base of the wall, shore up the tunnel with timbers, pack it with combustibles, wood, brush, anything that burns hot, and then light it. When the supports burn through, the tunnel roof collapses, dragging part of the wall down into the hollow. At least that's the plan. Inside Constantinople, people hear rumours of these mines long before they see any results. At first, it's just a sense of something odd. A faint, regular thudding felt through the soles of feet on stone, a strange dull vibration at certain towers in the small hours of the night. The priests say more prayers. The captains call for silence along the ramparts. Men lean out over the parapets, listening for what they cannot yet see. Someone remembers that mining was used in earlier sieges of the city, and that there were ways to fight it. The Byzantines begin to dig back. Countermines. From inside towers and from safe courtyards just behind the land wall, they open their own shafts, descending into the cool, damp earth. It is cramped work. Torches smoke and sputter, air grows stale quickly, and every swing of a pick sends tiny showers of dust down from the low ceiling. They listen as much as they dig. Veteran miners, some Greeks, some Genoese, some perhaps hired from abroad, press their ears to the ground, to wooden beams, to thin panels of stretched metal. They use bowls of water, watching for tiny ripples that betray vibrations. When they hear Ottoman picks, they adjust their tunnel's course, edging toward the sound like hunters tracking prey by an echo. Sometimes 2 tunnels meet, a thin crust of soil gives way, and suddenly 2 groups of men who have never seen each other face to face in daylight are staring at one another in the flicker of torchlight, at arm's length in a choking, narrow space. What follows is not elegant. It is wrestling and stabbing in the dark, the press of bodies in a space too tight even to swing a sword properly. Short weapons, daggers, axes, picks become tools of survival. Smoke from torches and from hastily lit fires rolls through the low passages, burning eyes and lungs. Earth walls crumble when someone is shoved too hard. Screams are muffled, not by mercy, but by soil. The sources give glimpses of these encounters. They mention a Serbian miner captured underground and interrogated for details of Ottoman plans. They describe Byzantine teams flooding a tunnel with water or smoke to force the enemy out. They hint at the strange intimacy of this kind of war, where the enemy is close enough to touch, but the fight remains invisible to those above. Not every mine meets a countermine in such dramatic fashion. Sometimes the defenders detect a tunnel and simply collapse it from above, digging a shaft down and choking it with rocks and rubble. Sometimes the Ottomans misjudge their direction or depth and end up under harmless ground, their effort wasted. Sometimes the charge is lit, the supports burn, and a section of wall does indeed slump and crack, only to reveal another earthwork hastily thrown up behind it, or a gap rapidly filled by carpenters and labourers working under fire. This is the pattern now. Blow, repair, dig, collapse, advance, counter. Neither side trusts the surface anymore. Every tower might be resting on a hollow. Every solid-looking stretch of wall might be undermined. Noise in the night could be rats, or it could be the slow approach of men who intend to erase the stones under your feet. Above ground, the struggle is no less inventive. Mehmed does not rely only on cannon and mines. He brings in carpenters and shipwrights, men who know how to build high, how to shape and join great timbers. Out in the no-man's land beyond the walls, under cover of night and banks of earth, they begin assembling something that looks at first like a barn or a blockhouse. It grows taller every day, a siege tower, or rather several of them. These are not the small wooden towers you might imagine from a textbook sketch. Contemporary descriptions suggest multi-story machines, clad in hides to resist fire, rolling on heavy wheels or sliding on greased planks. Inside, ladders and platforms let archers, crossbowmen and assault troops climb tier by tier. At the top, a bridge can be dropped onto the parapet of the wall, making a temporary wooden causeway from ground to battlement. In theory, a well-placed tower can cancel out the advantage of height that defenders enjoy. It lets attackers shoot down into the walkway behind the battlements. It offers an elevated position from which to sweep the wall with arrows and handguns, and, if brought close enough, it becomes a direct ramp for storming parties. In practice, every foot of ground between the tower and the masonry is contested. The Byzantines see these structures rising and respond the way their predecessors did in other sieges, with fire, with counter-towers, with earth. They drag up their own timbers, building inner scaffolds and raised platforms behind the threatened sections so that their archers can meet Ottoman marksmen eye to eye. They improve the crenellations, stack sandbags, move small cannons to upper levels. They stretch out hooks and chains designed to snag and tear at any assault bridge that might drop across the gap, and they prepare flammables, pitch, oil, resin, bundles of dry brush. If an Ottoman tower gets close enough, they intend to set it alight. Mehmed's engineers know this and try to anticipate. They soak the tower's outer hides. They hang wet woolen mattresses, thick felt, anything that might smother sparks. They mount small guns and archers inside to sweep the walls and keep defenders' heads down while the tower creeps forward. Labourers lay fascines, bundles of brushwood, into the deep ditch in front of the walls to create a ramp. Others fill in with earth and stones, under rain of arrows and stones from above. The tower inches on its path, pushed and pulled by ropes, perhaps dragged by teams of men and animals. Sometimes it works. Sometimes a tower does reach assault range, and for a brief time the upper air between Ottoman wood and Byzantine stone becomes a tight, lethal space. Men shout and fire and hurl hooks, trying to latch onto each other's structure or to drag down the enemy's bridge. Sometimes it fails spectacularly. Chroniclers describe one large tower that caught fire, whether from Greek fire, simple burning pitch, or some improvised mixture, and burned through its cladding faster than the crews could douse the flames. In the night, lit orange from within, it became a sort of inverted candle, collapsing among its own builders to cheers from the walls. None of these single events decides the siege. That is what begins to weigh on people. Each new Ottoman device, each daring escalade, each fresh mine or tower is met by some countermeasure. A tunnel broken, a tower burned, a breach filled with carts and furniture and barrels, anything that will hold back a rush for another few precious hours. Inside the city, ingenuity is stretched thin. Artisans who once made jewellery or church fittings are now casting shot and repairing gun carriages. Sailmakers patch torn banners into makeshift screens against arrows. Stonecutters and masons become emergency engineers, judging which cracks are superficial and which threaten collapse. Specialists matter more than ever. The Genoese commander Giustiniani deploys his veteran infantry where the danger is greatest, shifting them along the walls like a mobile plug. Ottoman sappers from different regions, Bosnians, Anatolians, probably some with experience from past sieges in Europe, bring their own local techniques to the mines and trenches. Information becomes a weapon in its own right. Deserters and prisoners on both sides feed their captors' stories. Some are true. Some may be embellished to win favour or to mislead. A captured miner might reveal the approximate number and location of tunnels. A frightened local might exaggerate internal dissent within the city, hoping to save his skin by predicting an imminent surrender. Commanders must decide night after night which whispers to believe. Is that tremor under Tower X the result of mining, or simply the settling of old stone under bombardment? Is the report of a planned mass assault tomorrow accurate, or a ploy to draw defenders away from a different sector? As days stretch into weeks, the siege begins to feel less like a single event and more like a contest of endurance and adaptation. The Ottomans can bring new men to the trenches, rotate units, call for more powder and timber from their vast hinterland. Mehmed visits the works, urges on the sappers, consults his engineers, impatient for a decisive breach. Inside the walls there is nowhere to rotate from. Every able body is already in use. Sleep comes in short, broken snatches. People doze in their armour, on stairways, in the corners of chapels that serve as aid stations. The smell of damp earth from the countermines mingles with smoke from the foundries, and the sour reek of too many humans packed in too small a space. Yet the city still stands. For each Ottoman success, a tower inched closer, a section of outer wall mangled by guns, a mine that does collapse part of a bastion, there is a corresponding patch, a frantic repair, a line held at the last ditch. The logic of the siege is changing, though. What began as a question, can cannon and sheer numbers crack walls that have defied centuries, is slowly becoming something different. How long can the defenders keep answering each new trick with one of their own? How long before the thin margin of manpower and material inside those ancient stones runs out? Both sides know that one night, one morning, some mine will succeed without a countermine, some tower will reach the wall intact, some combination of noise and fear and exhaustion will open a gap not in the stone, but in human resolve. They just don't know which day it will be. It turns out to be a Tuesday, or at least that's what later chroniclers calculate from their calendars. For the people in the city, and for the men in the trenches outside, it's simply another dawn that might be the last. The night before, May 28th, is strangely quiet. No great bombardment, no massed shouting from the Ottoman lines. Mehmed has ordered his guns to fall mostly silent, his troops to rest as much as they can. He knows what he's going to attempt at first light, and he wants them as ready as possible. Inside Constantinople, the quiet feels ominous. People gather in churches. In Hagia Sophia, the great dome glows with lamplight as priests chant through the night. Processions wind through streets that have seen too much already, icons and relics held high. Even some who have not attended a service in years find themselves in the crowd, drawn by fear, habit, or the need to be near other human beings when the future feels thin. On the walls there is no real rest. Men nap in shifts, armour still on, close to the parapets and the ladders that lead up to them. Others stand watch in the darkness, listening for the scrape of shovels, the creak of timbers being moved forward, the murmur of thousands of voices across the lines. Commanders walk the circuit again and again, peering into the half-light, checking on the state of repairs, counting how many torches are still burning. They know something is coming. They just don't know how large it will be, or where the main blow will fall. When dawn finally does begin to bleed into the eastern sky, it brings not peace, but noise. The sound comes in layers. First, the drums, deep, insistent, hundreds of them, beating a rhythm that seems to roll across the fields like distant thunder. Then trumpets and pipes, shrill and unrelenting. Then, over all of it, the chant of thousands of voices calling out prayers, war cries, verses. From the walls, the defenders watch as the Ottoman camp comes fully alive. Mehmed has arranged this last assault in waves. There are practical reasons for it. No commander wants his entire force tangled at once in a single confused rush. But there are psychological ones too. Each wave is meant to wear down the defenders a little more, to keep them from ever feeling that a push has been repelled and the danger has passed. The first wave moves forward. These are irregulars, the Azaps and other lightly armed troops from the frontier regions. Not the best equipped, not the most highly trained, but numerous. They surge toward the battered stretches of the Theodosian walls, especially near the Lycos Valley, where days of bombardment have gnawed at towers and curtain. Arrows and bolts begin to fly. Small cannon on both sides belch smoke and iron. The irregulars' job is simple and brutal. Overwhelm with numbers, fill the ditch with bodies and fascines, find any weakness. Ladders go up. Men climb. Many die before they are halfway. Some reach the parapet and are pushed back in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. For the defenders, this first assault is horrible, but familiar. They have done this before over the past weeks, rushed to threatened spots, thrown back ladders, hurled stones and firepots, thrust with pikes and swords over the crenellations. They know that if they can simply hold, the wave in front of them will tire, falter, and eventually pull back. And they do hold. After an hour, then two, the first attackers begin to thin out. The ditch in front of the walls is more choked than it was at dawn. The lower slopes are slick with blood and mud. But the lines on the ramparts are still there. Mehmed lets the first wave ebb. Then he sends in the second. These are provincial troops from the Timar cavalry and more disciplined infantry, drawn from across the empire's domains. They move forward under better organisation, some protected by large shields, some carrying scaling ladders sturdier than the first. Behind them, the great cannon reopen, firing over their heads, trying to shake the already damaged masonry further before contact. The effect on the defenders is immediate. They have barely had time to snatch water, to shift a few wounded men toward the rear before the new assault is upon them. Arrows rain in thicker patterns. More ladders slam against the stone in multiple places at once. The defenders are forced to spread out, then to clump together in knots wherever an attack looks like it might succeed. Fatigue, which has been a background condition for weeks, begins to sharpen at the edges. Muscles that have been worked day after day start to tremble. Hands lose some of their sure grip on spear shafts and bowstrings. Eyes, rubbed raw by smoke and lack of sleep, miss small movements that might have been caught earlier in the siege. Every small deficit accumulates. Giustiniani, the Genoese commander, is where he has been for much of the siege, at the main point of danger. Near the St. Romanos gate, in the centre of the land walls, he and his armoured infantry have patched breaches, organised counterattacks, and personally led sorties when necessary. He moves now through thick smoke and shouted reports, sending small reserves where gaps appear, encouraging his exhausted men, trying to read the flow of the battle minute by minute. For several hours the second wave crashes against the walls. At some points they briefly gain footholds, planting flags on damaged towers, only to be thrown back by charges from within the city. Elsewhere, they never quite make the parapet, cut down by enfilading fire from neighbouring bastions. Corpses pile higher. The ditch is no longer an empty obstacle. It is a grotesque slope, making it both easier and more terrible to cross. At last these troops too begin to falter. They have taken heavy losses. The walls, though shaken, have not fallen. The defenders are bloodied but still in place. If this were a smaller siege, this might be the end of it. The attacker might break off, rethink, try again in a week. Mehmed has no intention of pausing. The third wave steps forward now. These are his elite janissaries, disciplined infantry who have trained for years, many of them taken as boys from Christian families, converted and moulded into soldiers loyal to the Sultan. They advance in stricter order, with officers and standards clearly visible, drums beating a more measured pace. At this point, the physical state of the defenders matters as much as the condition of the stone. They have been fighting almost continuously since dawn. Many have not slept properly in days. Armour feels twice as heavy as it did at the beginning of the month. The line is thinner, not only from casualties but from men pulled away to man other threatened points. The Janissaries aim straight for the sectors that have already been hammered. The same central region, the same battered towers and half-collapsed curtain walls. As they come on, a critical moment occurs. Exactly how it happens is described slightly differently by different sources, but the core event is widely agreed. Giustiniani is wounded. Some say by a cannon fragment, others by an arrow or a shot from a handgun. Whatever the precise cause, he receives a serious injury, likely to his chest or side, that makes it difficult to breathe or to stay upright in armour. For a man who has been the visible anchor of the defence in that sector, this is more than just one casualty. He tries to remain, but the pain and the risk of collapse force a decision. He is persuaded, or ordered, to withdraw to the rear for treatment. A small group of his men escorts him away from the wall, toward his ship or a more sheltered position. Word spreads with the speed of rumour and the weight of something everyone can see. Giustiniani is leaving. To weary eyes and frayed nerves, the sight of their most experienced commander being carried or led away looks like something larger than a medical evacuation. For some, it feels like the moment when outside hope is packing up and going home. Morale, which has held remarkably for weeks under bombardment and hunger, wavers. Some Genoese troops, bound personally to Giustiniani rather than to the emperor, may have begun to drift toward the rear as well, unsure who now commands them. Confusion thickens right where clarity is needed most. At almost the same time, near one of the damaged sections of wall, another small but crucial event takes place. A gate or postern, accounts usually identify it as the Kerkerporta, a minor opening in the northern stretch of the land walls, seems to have been left unsecured or is forced in the chaos. A handful of Ottoman soldiers find their way through, then more follow. This is not a grand cinematic breach with a tower crashing down in a single moment. It is something subtler and more dangerous, a small group inside the perimeter where no enemy should be, at a time when defenders are already stretched and disoriented. On the parapets, men suddenly find themselves attacked from both sides. Signals and shouted orders become hard to interpret. Is that noise from a ladder going up, or from enemies already inside the inner wall? Are the cries in Greek, Italian, Turkish? In the smoke and dust, with banners and standards intermixed, it becomes harder to tell who is winning which skirmish. Constantine XI, the emperor, is not in a palace. He's at the walls, in armour, moving among his men, trying to plug the gaps that are opening not only in stone, but in resolve. He's been doing this throughout the siege, visible proof that the last Byzantine emperor is willing to share the fate of his city. As the Ottoman troops begin to enter in larger numbers, both through broken sections of wall and through that fatal gate, he understands what is happening. This is no longer a matter of repelling an assault and then repairing overnight. This is the moment when the enemy presence inside the defences becomes too large to root out with the men and strength remaining. The organised line of resistance that had stretched, however thinly, along the land walls begins to fragment. Some groups fight on where they stand, unaware of how bad the situation has become elsewhere. Others, seeing Ottoman banners appear behind them, fall back toward inner lines, toward secondary barricades and streets that have been prepared for last-ditch fighting. Civilians who had been bringing water and stones to the walls now stream back toward the city centre, mingling with retreating soldiers, clogging movement. Constantine makes a choice that historians have remembered ever since. Rather than attempt to flee to a ship in the Golden Horn, rather than retreat to Hagia Sophia or some inner stronghold, he stays at the collapsing front. He reportedly removes or disguises the imperial insignia on his armour, perhaps so that he will die as a soldier among soldiers rather than as a target to be captured for ransom, with a small band of companions. Greeks, maybe a few foreign knights still at his side. He throws himself into the melee one last time. Sources from both sides agree that he falls in the fighting near the walls. The details blur. Some say his body is never definitively identified, that it disappears beneath the weight of battle, one more armoured corpse among many. Others claim that later the Ottomans find a body with imperial insignia and treat it as that of the emperor. In any case, from the city's point of view, Constantine vanishes into the chaos and does not return. With his death, or at least his disappearance from the field, any remaining hope of coordinated defence on the land side dissolves. The Janissaries and other Ottoman troops pour through breaches and openings, fanning out into the districts behind the walls. Individual groups of defenders still resist fiercely in towers, at gates, in side streets. Some manage brief, stubborn stands that slow the advance for minutes or hours. But there is no longer a single continuous line to hold. The siege, which for weeks had been a contest of engineering and endurance, tips suddenly and decisively into occupation and street fighting. By mid-morning, the ancient barrier that had turned back armies for a millennium has finally been crossed in force, not just at one point, but at several, under the combined pressure of broken stone, exhausted flesh, and frayed human belief. The city that had seemed for so long impossible to take is now open. So what in the end actually broke Constantinople? It's tempting to say the cannon did it. The great bronze monster, groaning and flashing in the early weeks of the siege, hurling stone balls that chewed away the outer walls and shook the inner ones. A single, simple cause. A new technology smashing an old world. It has a certain elegance as a story. But if you stand on those walls in your mind's eye, in that pale morning when the Janissaries finally surge through, the answer feels more complicated. The cannon certainly mattered. For 1,000 years, attackers had come up against the same problem. You can bring ladders, towers, rams, you can pile earth against the stone, you can tunnel and you can starve. But in the end, those Theodosian walls are still there, 3 layers deep, thick and well-planned, waiting for you. They can be patched faster than you can knock them down. They are not unbeatable, but they are resilient in a way the world had learned to respect. Heavy artillery changed the rhythm of that equation. Instead of chiselling, it allowed pounding. Day after day, week after week, Mehmed's guns focused on particular stretches, especially near the Lycos Valley, turning sections of what had once been layered defence into something closer to rubble, earthworks, and hastily repaired gaps. The walls did not collapse like cardboard, the way some legends later implied, but they were shaken, cracked, and forced into a different kind of war, one of constant emergency maintenance rather than confident strength. Still, cannon alone did not walk up those breaches. They did not climb ladders or force postern gates. Artillery opened possibilities. Something else had to exploit them. One of those something else's was logistics, the quiet, unromantic part of war that rarely makes it into paintings. Mehmed did not just bring big guns. He brought what you need to keep them firing for nearly 2 months. Teams of oxen to drag barrels and barrels of powder, wagons full of shot, smiths and carpenters to repair carriages, ropes, pulleys, spare timbers. He assembled powder ingredients from across his domains, organised their transport, coordinated engineers who knew how to sight batteries, how to shore up gun platforms so they would not sink into the soft ground. Around the cannon, the rest of his army had to be fed, watered, and supplied. Tens of thousands of men, horses, and camp followers eating and drinking every day, trampling the fields, consuming firewood. To sustain that mass in front of a single city for weeks required granaries filled in advance, roads readied, boats transporting grain and fodder across the straits. A siege is not just a ring of enemies. It is a moving marketplace, a temporary city wrapped around another city. The Ottomans knew how to build and maintain that outer city. Inside Constantinople, the contrast is sharp. The population was small, perhaps 50 to 60,000 people, in a space once home to several times that number. Large swathes of land lay within the walls as gardens and unused fields, not because the Byzantines had carefully planned for urban agriculture, but because they no longer had people to fill the neighbourhoods that used to stand there. Their granaries were not overflowing. Money for mercenaries, powder and provisions was scarce. Every day of the siege became a question of how long their food and their coin would last. Leadership, too, has to be added to the ledger. Mehmed was young, but he was not reckless in the way a storybook might portray a 19-year-old sultan besotted with glory. The siege shows patience and adaptation. When the Venetian chain blocked his navy from the Golden Horn, he did not simply accept it. He ordered ships dragged overland on greased timbers and rollers, around Galata and down into the inner harbour. An audacious plan, risky and logistically difficult, but executed well enough to shock the defenders on the walls when they saw Ottoman masts where no Ottoman masts should have been. When mines were dug toward the walls, and Byzantine counterminers intercepted and destroyed several of them, Mehmed brought in more specialised sappers. When assaults failed, he reorganised the timing, the composition, the direction of attack. He was not merely battering at the city like a closed fist. He was feeling for weaknesses, choosing moment and place. Constantine XI on the Byzantine side was by most accounts courageous and personally committed. He had taken a throne already surrounded by loss, provinces gone, tax base shrunk, Byzantine ships a faint echo of the navy that had once ruled these waters. In the siege he did what a good last emperor could do, shared hardship, stood at the walls, tried to hold together a defence made up of Greeks, Genoese, Venetians and other small contingents, each with their own leaders and loyalties. That may have been the more difficult task. The defence of Constantinople in 1453 was brave, but it was not unified in the way Mehmed's host was. The empire that had built the walls was long gone. This was a remnant, a coalition, an echo trying to sound like the original voice. The navy played its part as well, in quieter but decisive ways. Once Mehmed's galleys and transports, now partly stationed in the Golden Horn, could threaten the city from the waterside as well as from the land, the defenders lost the small comfort of a secure harbour. They had succeeded early in the siege in burning some Ottoman ships in a daring naval sortie. It was a tactical victory, but strategically they were still locked in. No large Christian relief fleet arrived in time to break the blockade. A few ships slipped through, bringing supplies or men, but not enough to change the balance. Surrounded on both sea and land, the city became less a fortress connected to a wider world and more an island slowly shrinking. Beneath the ground, the invisible struggle of mining and countermining added another layer. Ottoman sappers tried to tunnel under walls, pack chambers with explosives, and bring sections down from below. Greek and Italian miners listened for their approach, set counter-tunnels, flooded or collapsed them when possible. For days, these battles happened in darkness and confined space, with picks and small charges and hand-to-hand fighting underground. Each failed mine was a narrow escape. Each successful one, or even partially successful one, created another weak point to guard, another reason to shift tired men from one sector to another. Even when the walls held physically, the constant knowledge that the earth itself might give way under you eroded confidence. Physical weakness and human exhaustion moved in step. By the end, the Theodosian walls were still standing in many places, but they were no longer the same walls that had repelled earlier Arab, Bulgar or Rus attackers. Gunpowder had battered some stretches into compromised shapes. Centuries of reduced maintenance had left certain towers less solid than they had once been, and the garrison behind them was not the garrison of old, smaller, thinner, stretched over too much stone. Was it the Kerkerporter, that small gate left open, or forced in the confusion, that truly ended the city? Was it Giustiniani's wound, and the blow to morale his removal caused? Was it the final Janissary assault, timed to hit at the exact moment when fatigue and fear peaked? You can choose any of these as the moment. Historians and storytellers have done so for centuries. The truth is that each moment only mattered because of all the others that led up to it. The cannon was important because the walls had already been weakened by years of disrepair and weeks of bombardment. the Janissaries broke through because the defenders who met them had been running, fighting, and repairing almost without pause for nearly 2 months. The small gate mattered because so much attention and so many men were fixed on the battered central sectors that a minor opening could become a fatal one. When people later said, "One cannon ended Constantinople," they were not exactly lying, they were simplifying. Memory often does this. It likes a clean hinge to swing on. A single invention, a single decision, a single dramatic scene. Over time, the siege turned into a kind of parable in different traditions. For some in Europe, it became the story of brave but doomed Christian defenders overwhelmed by superior numbers and new technology. A tragic fall, the end of the Roman Empire at last. For some in the Islamic world, it became the fulfillment of a long-awaited prophecy and a testament to Ottoman destiny. For others looking back centuries later, it became a convenient marker on the timeline, the end of the Middle Ages, the beginning of something modern. None of these are entirely wrong, but all of them are partial. Because Constantinople did not vanish on that May morning. The city was sacked, yes, with all the horror and cruelty that word carries. People were killed, enslaved, displaced. Churches were stripped. Treasures, both sacred and mundane, were taken. The soundscape of the city changed. The bells silenced, the call to prayer echoing where hymns had once risen. But the place itself did not sink into the sea. Its streets still curved along the ridges. Its harbours still opened toward trade routes. Its great church, Hagia Sophia, still rose under its dome, soon to be reworked into a mosque. The city's population composition changed, its name and language and symbols bending toward a new centre. But life did not stop. In that sense, 1453 marks both an ending and a transformation. The Roman Byzantine state, which traced its legal continuity back more than 1,000 years, ceased to exist. The long story of emperors in purple, of Greek-speaking administrators sending edicts across provinces that once circled the Mediterranean, came to a close. For those inside the walls who had grown up with that identity, the loss was not abstract. It was a grief for a world. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire gained a true imperial capital. Mehmed did not intend Istanbul to be a mere trophy. He set about repopulating it, moving families in, restoring markets, commissioning new buildings while preserving and adapting some old ones. The city became the heart of a different empire, one that would itself last for centuries, shaping politics, trade and culture across 3 continents. Beyond the city, the shock waves spread out in slower, subtler ways. Refugees, scholars, scribes, artisans moved westward, carrying manuscripts and knowledge with them to Italian cities already buzzing with a rediscovery of classical texts. European powers, alarmed by Ottoman control of key eastern Mediterranean routes, looked increasingly to the ocean as an alternative. This did not cause the voyages of discovery by itself, but it nudged the needle. When you can no longer go easily through, you begin to think more seriously about going around. So when we say that Constantinople fell in 1453, we are really naming a cluster of changes that happened at different speeds. The walls broke in hours, the empire died in days, the city transformed over years, the region reorganized itself over decades, and the memory of that morning, of cannon thunder, of a last emperor at the walls, of banners changing over towers, has echoed for centuries. A single cannon shot did not erase a civilization. It helped tip a long, unsteady balance that had been listing for generations. What followed was not an empty ruin, but a new chapter written on very old stone. And perhaps that is why this story lingers. Not just because a city finally fell, but because in its fall we can see how endings and beginnings often arrive together, tangled in the same smoke. For the people inside the walls, though, history was not a neat line on a timeline. It was a day that went on, hour by slow hour. When the last organised resistance collapsed, there was no clean moment where everything turned from Byzantine to Ottoman. It was a blur of sound and motion. Doors smashed. Iron hinges shrieking. shouted orders in languages some citizens had never heard before. The crack of splintering wood as shops were forced open, the sudden awful quiet when someone realized there was nowhere left to run. In many medieval sieges there was an understood, if brutal, pattern. If a city resisted and was taken by storm, its population could be considered prize. Plunder and captives, as much as territory, were part of the expected payment for the attacking army. Mehmed had promised his men 3 days of sack if they succeeded. It was an incentive and a tradition, so when the gates were opened and the last defences folded, soldiers poured into a city that had once housed hundreds of thousands, now sparsely populated but still full of churches, mansions, warehouses and memories. People fled towards sanctuaries, especially Hagia Sophia. Medieval Christians, east and west, had long believed that sacred spaces might offer some protection, that conquerors might hesitate to violate them completely. On that morning, belief collided with practice. Crowds gathered under the great dome, voices overlapping in prayer and panic. They could hear the city fracturing outside, hooves on stone, the crash of statues pulled down, the rising crackle of fire. When soldiers finally pushed through the doors of Hagia Sophia itself, the threshold was not a boundary anymore. It was just another entrance. Accounts from that day, written later by survivors and outside observers, describe terror that is hard to compress into words. Men cut down in the streets, women and children seized as captives, altars stripped, sacred vessels taken. Some clergy died where they stood, others were enslaved. Icon frames were torn from walls, silver and gold peeled away like skin. For many inhabitants, the fall was not a symbol of an era ending. It was the loss of family, home, safety, all at once. And yet, even amid that violence, lines were being drawn that pointed toward a different future. Mehmed did not intend to leave Constantinople a wrecked shell. A burned and emptied city would be useless as a capital, so after the first intense wave of sack, he began to rein it in. The reports vary on how quickly and how effectively, but the general pattern is clear. He entered the city in triumph, performed prayers, issued orders. The wild energy of conquest began to be channeled into administration. One of his most symbolic acts was to go to Hagia Sophia and claim it for Islam. The great church, nearly 1,000 years old by then, had seen emperors crowned and councils convened. Now, with a few gestures and spoken words, it became an imperial mosque. Crosses came down. Islamic calligraphy would gradually appear. A mihrab, indicating the direction of Mecca, would be set into the apse. The building's bones stayed the same, but its meaning shifted. Elsewhere in the city, Mehmed's policies were surprisingly practical for a conqueror still in his teens. Constantinople was dangerously underpopulated. A capital that lived only in memory could not anchor his empire, so he set about repopulating it, sometimes gently, sometimes not. He offered tax incentives for those who would move there. He ordered Muslim, Christian and Jewish families from other parts of his domains to resettle within its walls. Some came willingly, drawn by opportunity. Others came because imperial command in the 15th century was not a suggestion. He reinstated markets, rebuilt parts of the harbour, and encouraged merchants, Greek, Armenian, Genoese, Jewish, and others, to trade under the new order. The city did not revert to the enormous cosmopolis of late antiquity, but it began to pulse again. New neighbourhoods grew in the shadows of old foundations. Religiously, Mehmed's approach combined dominance with managed tolerance. The Orthodox Church lost its emperor-protector, but it did not vanish. Instead, the Sultan placed it under his own authority. A new patriarch of Constantinople was chosen, and Mehmed treated him as the leader of all Orthodox subjects in his realm. In Ottoman practice, religious communities, millets, would be allowed a degree of self-governance in matters like marriage, inheritance, and internal discipline, as long as they acknowledged imperial supremacy and paid their taxes. For many Orthodox Christians, this was a bitter compromise. The Church survived, but as a subordinate institution within an Islamic empire. The ancient dream of Constantinople as the capital of a Christian oikumene, a world ordered around the emperor and the patriarch, was gone. Yet the alternative, wholesale extinction, did not happen. Monasteries on Mount Athos continued. Churches functioned, though often in altered form. The liturgy persisted in Greek and other languages, even if the political frame around it had changed. Beyond the city's walls, the shockwaves of 1453 took different shapes, depending on where you stood. In other Orthodox lands, Serbia, Bulgaria, the principalities along the Danube, the fall of Constantinople confirmed a trajectory many already sensed. The Ottomans were not a border nuisance. They were becoming the central power in the region. For Russian chroniclers far to the northeast, the catastrophe by the Bosporus fed a different idea, that Moscow might now be the third Rome, inheriting a spiritual role from a city that had been taken by non-Christians. Whether or not most people on the ground thought in such grand terms, the symbolism took root. In Western Europe, the news of the fall landed like a distant thunderclap. Word travelled slowly, by ship and messenger, filtered through merchants and diplomats. When confirmation came, it mixed fear, fascination, and a certain grim "we told you so" from those who had warned about the Ottoman advance. Pamphlets and sermons presented Constantinople's fall as divine punishment, as a call to crusade, as a sign of the times. Artists and writers imagined the last stand with a dramatic flair that bore only loose relation to the complex reality. The image of a beleaguered Christian city overrun by Eastern armies became a recurring motif. It would echo in political speeches and church rhetoric for generations. At the same time, European politics were rarely united. Rivalries between Venice and Genoa, between French and Burgundians, between popes and princes, had helped prevent a large coordinated relief effort before 1453. Those rivalries did not disappear after it. Appeals for crusades were made, but response was limited and uneven. Fear of the Ottomans coexisted with trade deals, diplomatic missions, and growing curiosity about this new imperial court in Istanbul. In the Mediterranean, the practical effects were significant. Control of Constantinople and the Straits meant the Ottomans could influence and often restrict movement between the Black Sea and the Aegean. Italian maritime powers had to navigate not just currents and winds, but treaties and tolls. Overland routes that had once run through Byzantine territory now crossed Ottoman-administered lands. Did this single event cause European explorers to look westward across the Atlantic or south around Africa? Probably not in a simple straight line. The motives for exploration included competition among European states, the lure of spices and gold, advances in shipbuilding and navigation, and many other threads. But losing a familiar overland and eastern route to a powerful new gatekeeper did make alternative paths more appealing. You can think of 1453 not as the spark that lit the age of exploration, but as one of several logs added to a fire that was already smouldering. This is where historians sometimes reach for big labels. They say, 1453, the end of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages close, the Renaissance opens, the modern world begins. There is a certain convenience in this. Teachers need dates, textbooks like chapters. Constantinople's fall is dramatic, well documented and easy to remember. It lives next to other mid-15th century milestones. Gutenberg's printing press in Europe, new currents in art and thought in Italian cities, the gradual consolidation of stronger monarchies in places like France and England. But when you look closely, the edges blur. From the point of view of a farmer in Anatolia, 1453 may have changed nothing immediately. The taxes were collected by a different official. The language in the distant capital shifted. Daily life went on. For a Venetian merchant, it altered risk calculations, not the basic fact of sailing and bargaining. For a scholar in Florence, Greek manuscripts arriving from the East accelerated a movement that had already been underway for decades. it might help to think of 1453 as a hinge that did not slam shut but rather creaked slowly over time. The siege and fall compressed certain changes into a vivid story, but the underlying transformations, state-building, technological adaptation, shifting religious and political balances, were longer processes. So why does this particular story still hold us? Partly because it sits at the crossroads of so many themes. Endurance. A city that had stood against sieges for a millennium finally worn down. Technology. Bronze cannon and gunpowder reshaping what stone walls could mean. Fate. The sense, in later retellings, that something inevitable had at last come to pass, even though the people living through it could not see history's script. Partly too because it resists a single moral. You can tell it as a tale of tragic loss, of libraries and mosaics and traditions extinguished. You can tell it as a story of renewal, of an energetic new empire making an old city its own and giving it fresh life as Istanbul. You can emphasize the suffering of those 3 days of sack, or the centuries of relative coexistence that followed under the Ottomans, where churches, synagogues and mosques stood within walking distance of each other. In the quiet of night, imagining those walls and that final morning, you might be tempted to choose sides, to decide whether the fall was good or bad, progress or disaster. History rarely grants us such tidy verdicts. What it does offer in a story like this is perspective, a reminder that even the mightiest defences can be outpaced by new tools and new strategies, that cities, like people, carry many identities across their lifespans, that an ending, however sharp it feels to those inside it, is almost always part of a wider, slower rearrangement. After the fall, the streets of Constantinople did not empty forever. They filled again with different languages, different prayers, different banners overhead. Children grew up calling the city by another name. They walked past the same stones, the same harbour lines, the same hills, without feeling the same grief that had once soaked into them. The walls remained, patched and repurposed, no longer the unbroken shield of an empire, but still a line between inside and outside. The cannon that had battered them fell silent, then were melted down, replaced by newer guns or newer fortifications. What endured was the place itself, and the memory of that spring in 1453 passed down and reshaped, told and retold, until it became less a single event and more a symbol, a way of thinking about how worlds change, not in an instant, but in a series of blows, repairs, choices and chances that only later look like destiny. Think back to where we began, a city that had turned back armies for more than 1,000 years, a ring of stone that had watched empires rise and fall, plagues sweep through, crusaders come and go. Generations of enemies had stood before those walls and gone away again, defeated or exhausted or simply outlasted. And then, in a single spring, in just 53 days, it fell. That contrast is part of why Constantinople's story hangs in the air long after the last cannon went silent. For so long, it represented the idea that some places are simply too strong, too well defended, too well prepared to break. The fall shows how quickly that feeling of permanence can dissolve. It might be tempting to say it was the cannon, one invention, one weapon, one young sultan with the nerve to use it. But if you follow the threads backward, the picture becomes more complicated. No wall is only stone. Those ramparts were thousands of decisions layered on top of each other. They were the taxes collected centuries before, the engineers who inspected cracks, the masons who knew which mortar would cure best in sea air. They were also the treaties signed and broken, the trade routes that enriched some years and starved others, the plagues that emptied neighbourhoods, the gradual shrinking of an empire whose borders once stretched far beyond the horizon. By 1453, the same walls stood, but the world around them had shifted. Gunpowder had moved from experiment to battlefield tool, regional powers had rearranged, allies were distracted or divided. The population inside the city was smaller, the treasury was thinner, The defenders were brave, but fewer. The besiegers were organized, well supplied, and led by someone who had grown up with siege guns as a fact, not a novelty. So when we imagine that final cannon shot punching through the battered masonry, it's not really a single cause-cracking stone. It's the weight of all those changes, political, economic, technological, pressing down on a very specific place at a very specific time, and yet the reverse is true as well. No conquest comes from one direction alone. Mehmed's victory was not just a matter of bigger guns, it drew on administrators who could gather resources from across an expanding realm, on shipwrights who built fleets and sailors who navigated dangerous currents, on scholars who translated and adapted knowledge, including some inherited indirectly from the very empire they were fighting. It relied on the choices of Venetian and Genoese merchants who decided when to trade, when to fight, and when to wait, on Western princes who measured the cost of a crusade against their own local rivalries and hesitated, on Orthodox rulers who weighed whether to commit scarce troops to a city that might already be lost. From within the walls, it may have felt like a simple equation, a beleaguered city versus an overwhelming army. From a distance, it resolves into a web of intersecting stories, each pulling the outcome a little one way or another. This is one of the quiet lessons of Constantinople's fall. History looks sharp in hindsight, but it is soft at the edges while it is happening. People make decisions based on limited information, old habits, hopes that the future will resemble the past a little longer. Walls are maintained as if they will stand forever, until one day they don't. If you let your mind drift over the centuries, you can almost see time passing along those ramparts. Legionaries in bronze helmets. Later, soldiers in mail and lamella armour. Later still, men in turbans walking patrols along the same parapets, looking out over the same sea. The stones remain, but the flags above them change. The chants from the city below shift languages, melodies, faiths. From a sufficient distance, the fall of 1453 is not just the end of one thing. It's a turn in a longer curve. Rome, Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire, the nation-states that followed them, all are chapters in a story that keeps being written on that same patch of earth by the Bosporus. That sense of scale can be strangely calming. It suggests that what feels absolute in one lifetime is part of a larger pattern of building and unbuilding, of walls raised and walls broken, of names written on maps and then overwritten in a different script. It doesn't erase the suffering of those who lost homes and lives in those 53 days, but it sets their experience inside a long, slow river of change that began long before them and continues long after. Maybe that's why this story still lingers when you listen to it at night. It holds both the fragility and the resilience of human things. It shows how knowledge and technology can erode old certainties. It reminds us that cities are more than stone and mortar. They are the layered memories of everyone who has ever walked their streets. When one version of a city dies, another often grows in its shadow, using the same foundations, rearranged. If you're listening to this as you fall asleep, somewhere far from the Bosporus, that distance is part of the story too. A siege fought 6 centuries ago, in a city you may never visit, still reaches you through language, through curiosity, through the simple human habit of passing tales from one person to another. Before you drift off completely, if you'd like to help more people find these quiet journeys through the past, you might tap like, or subscribe, or leave a comment. It's a small modern gesture, but it's another way of adding your thread to the tapestry. And if you do comment, you're welcome to share where you're listening from. A bedroom in a crowded city, a dorm room, a small house on a quiet street, a night shift break room, all of those places scattered across the map, briefly connected by a story about a city that once seemed impossible to break, and the cannon and the choices that finally did. For now, let the walls fade in your mind. The torches burn out. The harbour grows still. The city is still there, under every later name it has carried, under every new layer of stone. History moves on. The stones remember. And you, listening in the dark, are part of that remembering too.